In the meantime, Bunsby, still hugging Miss Snipper for his friend, the captain had not exaggerated the softness of his heart, uniformly preserved his gravity of deportment, and showed no other consciousness of her or anything. Uncle Saul, who had come home, received them at the door and ushered them immediately into the little back parlor, strangely altered by the absence of Walter on the table, and about the room were the charts and maps on which the heavy-hearted instrument maker had again tracked the missing vessel across the sea, and on which, with a pair of compasses that he still had in his hand, he had been measuring a minute before how far she must have driven here or there, and trying to demonstrate that a long time must elapse before hope was exhausted. "Whether she can have run," said Uncle Saul, looking wistfully over the chart, "but no, that's impossible, or whether she can have been forced by stress of weather, but that's not reasonably likely, or whether there is any hope she has far changed her course, as but even I can hardly hope that." With such broken suggestions, poor old Uncle Saul roamed over the great sheet before him and could not find a speck of hopeful probability in it large enough to set one small point of the compasses upon. Florence saw immediately it would have been difficult to help seeing that there was a singular, indescribable change in the old man, and that while his manner was far more restless and unsettled than usual, there was yet a curious contradictory decision in it that perplexed her very much. She fancied once that he spoke wildly and at random for on her, saying she regretted not to have seen him when she had been there before that morning. He at first replied that he had been to see her, and directly afterwards seemed to wish to recall that answer. "You have been to see me," said Florence. "Today, yes, my dear young lady," returned Uncle Saul, looking at her and away from her in a confused manner. "I wish to see you with my own eyes, and to hear you with my own ears once more." Before there he stopped. "Before what?" said Florence, putting her hand upon his arm. "Did I say before?" replied Old Soul. "If I did, I must have meant before we should have news of my dear boy." "You are not well," said Florence tenderly. "You have been so very anxious." "I'm sure you're not well." "I am as well," returned the old man, shutting up his right hand and holding it out to show her, "as well and firm as any man at my time of life can hope to be. See, it's steady is its master, not as capable of resolution and fortitude as many a younger man." "I think so. We shall see." There was that in his manner more than in his words, though they remained with her, to which impressed Florence so much that she would have confided her uneasiness to Captain Cuttle at that moment if the captain had not seized that moment for expounding the state of circumstance on which the opinion of the sagacious Bunsby was requested, and entreating that profound authority to deliver the same Bunsby, whose eye continued to be addressed to somewhere about the halfway house between London and Gravesend, 2 or 3 times put out his rough right arm as seeking to wind it for inspiration round the fair form of Miss Snipper, but that young female having withdrawn herself in displeasure to the opposite side of the table, the soft hearts of the commander of the cautious Clara met with no response to its impulses. After sundry failures in this wise, the commander, addressing himself to nobody, thus spake, or rather the voice within him said of its own accord and quite independent of himself, as if he were possessed by a gruff spirit, "My name's Jack Bunsby." "He was christened John," cried the delighted Captain Cuttle. "Hear him, and what I says," pursued the voice, after some deliberation. "I stuns to the captain, with Florence on his arm, nodded at the auditorium, and seemed to say, 'No, he's coming out. This is what I meant when I brought him,' whereby proceeded the voice, "Why not? If so, what arts can any man say otherwise?" "No, I ask then." When it had pursued its train of argument to this point, the voice stopped and rested it, then proceeded very slowly, "This do I believe, that this year's sun and air has gone down, my lads, me up. Do I say so? Or which, if a skipper stands out by St. George's Channel, making for the Downs, what's right ahead of him? The good wines. He isn't forced to run upon the good wines, but he may. The bearings of this observation lays in the application on it. That ain't no part of my duty, alas. Then keep a bright lookout for it, and good luck to you." The voice here went out of the back parlor and into the street, taking the commander of the cautious Clutter with it, and accompanying him on board again with all convenient expedition, where immediately turned in and refreshed his mind with a nap, the students of the sage's precepts, left to their own application of his wisdom upon a principle which was the main leg of the Bunsby tripod, as it is perchance of some other oracular stools, looked upon one another in a little uncertainty. while Rob the Grinder, who had taken the innocent freedom of peering in and listening through the skylight in the roof, came softly down from the ledges in a state of very dense confusion. Captain Cuttle, however, whose admiration of Bunsby was if possible enhanced by the splendid manner in which he had justified his reputation and come, through this solemn reference, proceeded to explain that Bunsby meant nothing but confidence, that Bunsby had no misgivings, and that such an opinion as that man had given, coming from such a mind as his, was hope's own anchor with good roads to cast it in. Florence endeavored to believe that the captain was right, but the nipper, with her arms tight folded, shook her head in resolute denial, and had no more trust in Bunsby than in Mr. Perch himself. The philosophers seemed to have left Uncle Sol pretty much where he had found him, for he still went roaming about the watery world, compasses in hand, and discovering no rest for them. It was in pursuance of a whisper in his ear from Florence, while the old man was absorbed in this pursuit, that Captain Cuttle laid his heavy hand upon his shoulder. "What cheer, Sal, girls?" cried the captain heartily. "But so, Ned," returned the instrument maker. "I have been remembering all this afternoon that on the very day when my boy entered Donby's house and came home late to dinner, sitting just there where you stand, we talked of storm and shipwreck, and I could hardly turn him from the subject, but meeting the eyes of Florence, which were fixed with earnest scrutiny upon his face, the old man stopped and smiled. "Stand by, old friend," cried the captain. "Look alive, I tell you what sail gills I drive convoy, heart's delight, safe home here." The captain kissed his hook to Florence. "I'll come back and take you in tow for the rest of this blessed day. You come and eat your dinner along with me, Saul, somewheres or other." "Not today, Ned," said the old man quickly, and appearing to be unaccountably startled by the proposition. "Not today, I couldn't do it." "Why not?" returned the captain, gazing at him in astonishment. "I have so much to do, I mean to think of and arrange. I couldn't do it, Ned, indeed. I must go out again and be alone and turn my mind too many things today." The captain looked at the instrument maker and looked at Florence and again at the instrument maker. "Tomorrow," then he suggested at last. Yes, tomorrow," said the old man. "Think of me tomorrow. Say tomorrow I shall come here early, mine." Hal Gills stipulated the captain. Yes, the first thing tomorrow morning," said Old Soul. "And now goodbye, Ned Cuttle, and God bless you," squeezing both the captain's hands with uncommon fervor. As he said it, the old man turned to Florence, folded hers in his own, and put them to his lips, then hurried her out to the coach with very singular precipitation. Altogether, he made such an effect on Captain Cuttle that the captain lingered behind and instructed Rob to be particularly gentle and attentive to his master until the morning, which injunction he strengthened with the payment of 1 shilling down and the promise of another 6pence before noon next day. This kind office performed Captain Cuttle, who considered himself the natural and lawful bodyguard of Florence, mounted the box with a mighty sense of his trust, and escorted her home. At parting, he assured her that he would stand by Saul Gills close and true, and once again inquired of Susan Nipper, unable to forget her gallant words in reference to Mrs. McStinger. "Would you, do you think, my dear?" Though when the desolate house had closed upon the two, the captain's thoughts reverted to the old instrument maker, and he felt uncomfortable. Therefore, instead of going home, he walked up and down the street several times, and eking out his leisure until evening, dined late at a certain angular little tavern in the city, with a public parlor like a wedge, to which glazed hats much resorted. The captain's principal intention was to pass Saul Giles's after dark and look in through the window which he did. The parlor door stood open, and he could see his old friend writing busily and steadily at the table within, while the midshipmen, already sheltered from the night Jews, watched him from the counter under which Rob the Grinder made his own bed preparatory to shutting the shop. Reassured by the tranquility that reigned within the precincts of the Wooden Mariner, the captain headed for Brig Place, resolving to weigh anchor betimes in the morning. Chapter 24. The study of a loving heart. Sir Barnet and Lady Skettle's very good people resided in a pretty villa at Fulham on the banks of the Thames, which was one of the most desirable residences in the world when a rowing match happened to be going past, but had its little inconveniences at other times, among which may be enumerated the occasional appearance of the river in the drawing-room, and the contemporaneous disappearance of the lawn and shrubbery. Sir Barnet Skettles expressed his personal consequence chiefly through an antique gold snuff box, and a ponderous silk pocket kerchief which he had an imposing manner of drawing out of his pocket like a banner and using with both hands at once. Subarnet's object in life was constantly to extend the range of his acquaintance like a heavy body dropped into water, not to disparage so worthy a gentleman by the comparison. It was in the nature of things that Subarnet could spread an ever-widening circle about him, until there was no room left or like a sound, in air the vibration of which, according to the speculation of an ingenious modern philosopher, may go on traveling forever through the interminable fields of space. Nothing but coming to the end of his moral tether could stop Subarnet Skettles. In his voyage of discovery through the social system, Subarnet was proud of making people acquainted with people. He liked the thing for its own sake, and it advanced his favorite object to, for example, if Subarnet had the good fortune to get hold of a law recruit or a country gentleman, and ensnared him to his hospitable villa, Subarnet would say to him on the morning after his arrival, "Now, my dear sir, is there anybody you would like to know? Who is there you would wish to meet? Do you take any interest in writing people, or in painting, or sculpturing people, or in acting people, or in anything of that sort?" Possibly. The patient answered yes, and mentioned somebody of whom Subarnet had no more personal knowledge than of Ptolemy the Great. Subarnet replied that nothing on earth was easier, as he knew him very well. Immediately called on the aforesaid somebody, left his card, wrote a short note: "My dear sir, penalty of your eminent position, friend at my house, naturally desirous ladies, Skittles and myself participate. Trust the genius being superior to ceremonies. You will do us the distinguished favor of giving us the pleasure, etc., etc." And so killed a brace of birds with one stone, dead as door nails, with the snuff box and banner in full force. Subarnet Kettles propounded his usual inquiry to Florence on the first morning of her visit, when Florence thanked him and said there was no one in particular whom she desired to see. It was natural she should think with a pang of poor lost Walter, when Sir Barnard Skettles, urging his kind offer, said, "My dear Miss Tomboy, are you sure you can remember no one whom your good papa, to whom I beg you present the best compliments of myself and Lady Skettles, when you write, might wish you to know?" It was natural perhaps that her poor head should droop a little, and that her voice should tremble as it softly answered in the negative. Skettles Jr., much stiffened as to his cravat, and sober down as to his spirits, was at home for the holidays, and appeared to feel himself aggrieved by the solicitude of his excellent mother that he should be attentive to Florence. Another, and a deep injury, under which the soul of young Barnet chafed, was the company of Dr. and Mrs. Bleember, who had been invited on a visit to the paternal roof tree, and of whom the young gentleman often said he would have preferred their passing the vacation at Jericho. "Is there anybody you can suggest now, Dr. Bleember?" said Subarnet Skettles, turning to that gentleman. "You are very kind, Sir Barnard," returned Dr. Bleember. "Really, I am not well, that there is in particular. I like to know my fellow men in general," said Barnard. "What does Terence say? Anyone who is the parent of a son is interesting to me. Has Mrs. Bleember any wish to see any remarkable person?" asked Subarnet courteously. Mrs. Bleember replied with a sweet smile and a shake of her sky-blue cap that if Subarnet could have made her known to Cicero, she would have troubled him, but such an introduction not being feasible, and she already enjoying the friendship of himself and his amiable lady, and possessing with the doctor her husband their joint confidence in regard to their dear son here, young Barnard was observed to curl his nose. She asked no more. Sabat was fain under these circumstances to content himself for the time with the company assembled. Florence was glad of that, for she had a study to pursue among them, and it lay too near her heart, and was too precious and momentous to yield to any other interest. There were some children staying in the house, children who were as frank and happy with fathers and with mothers as those rosy faces opposite home, children who had no restraint upon their love and freely showed it. Florence sought to learn their secret, sought to find out what it was she had missed, what simple art they knew, and she knew not how she could be taught by them to show her father that she loved him and to win his love again. Many a day did Florence thoughtfully observe these children. On many a bright morning did she leave her bed when the glorious sun rose, and walking up and down upon the river's bank, before anyone in the house was stirring, look up at the windows of their rooms and think of them asleep, so gently tended and affectionately thought of Florence, would feel more lonely then than in the great house all alone, and would think sometimes that she was better there then, hearing that there was greater peace in hiding herself than in mingling with others of her age, and finding how unlike them all she was, but attentive to her study. Though it touched her to the quick at every little leaf she turned in the hard book, Florence remained among them and tried with patient hope to gain the knowledge that she yearned for. How to gain it, how to know the charm in its beginning. There were daughters here who rose up in the morning and lay down to rest at night, possessed of fathers' hearts already. They had no repulse to overcome, no coldness to dread, no frown to smooth away as the morning advanced and the windows opened one by one, and the dew began to dry upon the flowers and youthful feet began to move upon the lawn. Florence, glancing round at the bright faces, thought what was there she could learn from these children. It was too late to learn from them. Each could approach her father fearlessly and put up her lips to meet the ready kiss, and wind her arm about the neck that bent down to caress her. She could not begin by being so bold. Oh, could it be that there was less and less hope as she studied more and more? She remembered well that even the old woman who had robbed her, when a little child, whose image and whose house and all she had said and done was stamped upon her recollection with the enduring sharpness of a fearful impression, made at that early period of life, had spoken fondly of her daughter, and how terribly even she had cried out in the pain of hopeless separation from her child. But her own mother, she would think again, when she recalled this, had loved her well. Then sometimes, when her thoughts reverted swiftly to the void between herself and her father, Florence would tremble, and the tears would start upon her face as she pictured to herself her mother living on and coming also to dislike her because of her wanting the unknown grace that should conciliate that father naturally, and had never done so. From her cradle she knew that this imagination did wrong to her mother's memory, and had no truth in it or base to rest upon, and yet she tried so hard to justify him and to find the whole blame in herself that she could not resist its passing. Like a wild cloud through the distance of her mind, there came among the other visitors soon after Florence one beautiful girl 3 or 4 years younger than she, who was an orphan child and who was accompanied by her aunt, a gray-haired lady who spoke much to Florence and who greatly liked, but that they all did to hear her sing of an evening, and would always sit near her at that time with motherly interest. There had only been 2 days in the house when Florence, being in an arbor in the garden one warm morning, musingly observant of a youthful group upon the turf, through some intervening boughs and wreathing flowers for the head of one little creature among them, who was the pet and plaything of the rest, heard this same lady, and her niece, in pacing up and down a sheltered nook close by, speak of herself as Florence, an orphan like me. Aunt said the child, no, my love, she has no mother, but her father is living. Is she in mourning for her poor mamma now? Inquired the child quickly. No, for her only brother. Has she no other brother? None. No sister? None. I am very, very sorry, said the little girl as they stopped soon afterwards to watch some boats, and had been silent in the meantime. Florence, who had risen when she heard her name and had gathered up her flowers to go and meet them that they might know of her being within hearing, resumed her seat in work, expecting to hear no more. But the conversation recommenced next moment. Florence is a favorite with everyone here, and deserves to be, I am sure, said the child earnestly. Where is her papa? The aunt replied after a moment's pause that she did not know. Her tone of voice arrested Florence, who had started from her seat again, and held her fastened to the spot with her work hastily caught up to her bosom and her to hands, saving it from being scattered on the ground. He is in England. I hope, aunt, said the child. I believe so. Yes, I know he is indeed. Has he ever been here? I believe not. No. Is he coming here to see her? I believe not. Is he lame or blind? Or aunt asked the child. The flowers that Florence held to her breast began to fall. When she heard those words so wonderingly spoken, she held them closer, and her face hung down upon them. Kate said, the lady, after a moment of silence, I will tell you the whole truth about Florence as I have heard it, and believe it to be. Tell no one else, my dear, because it may be little known here, and your doing so would give her pain. I never will, exclaimed the child. I know you never will, returned the lady. I can trust you as myself. I fear then, Kate, that Florence's father cares little for her, very seldom sees her, never was kind to her in her life, and now quite shuns her and avoids her. She would love him dearly if he would suffer her, but he will not, though for no fault of hers, and she is greatly to be loved and pitied by all gentle hearts. More of the flowers that Florence held fell scattering on the ground. Those that remained were wet, but not with the dew, and her face dropped upon her laden hands. Poor Florence, dear good Florence, cried the child. Do you know why I have told you this, Kate, said the lady, that I may be very kind to her, and take great care to try to please her. Is that the reason, Aunt? Partly, said the lady, but not although we see her so cheerful with a pleasant smile for everyone, ready to oblige us all, and bearing her part in every amusement here, she can hardly be quite happy. Do you think she can, Kate? I'm afraid not, said the little girl, and you can understand, pursued the lady, why her observation of children who have parents who are fond of them and proud of them, like many here just now, should make her sorrowful in secret. Yes, dear aunt, said the child, I understand that very well. Poor Florence. More flowers strayed upon the ground, and though she yet held to her breast, trembled as if a wintry wind were rustling them. My Kate, said the lady, whose voice was serious but very calm and sweet, and had so impressed Florence from the first moment of her hearing it of all the youthful people here. You are her natural and harmless friend, and have not the innocent means that happier children have. There are none happy, our aunt, exclaimed the child, who seemed to cling about her as other children have, dear Kate, of reminding her of her misfortune. Therefore I would have you, when you try to be her little friend, try all the more for that, and feel that the bereavement you sustain, thank heaven, before you knew its weight, gives you claim and hold upon poor Florence. But I am not without a parent's love, aunt, and I never have been, said the child. With you, however, that may be, my dear, returned the lady. Your misfortune is a lighter one then. Florence is for not an orphan in the wide world can be so deserted as the child, who is an outcast from a living parent's love. The flowers were scattered on the ground like dust, the empty hands were spread upon the face, and orphan Florence, shrinking down upon the ground, wept long and bitterly. But true of heart and resolute in her good purpose, Florence held to it as her dying mother held by her upon the day that gave Paul life. He did not know how much she loved him, however long the time in coming, and however slow the interval, she must try to bring that knowledge to her father's heart one day or other. Meantime, she must be careful in no thoughtless word or look or burst of feeling awakened by any chance circumstance to complain against him, or to give occasion for these whispers to his prejudice. Even in the response she made, the orphan child, to whom she was attracted strongly, and whom she had such occasion to remember, Florence was mindful of him if she singled her out. To plainly Florence thought from among the rest she would confirm in one mind, certainly perhaps in more, the belief that he was cruel and unnatural. Her own delight was no set off to this. What she had overheard was a reason not for soothing herself but for saving him, and Florence did it in pursuance of the study of her heart. She did so always if a book were read aloud, and there were anything in the story that pointed to an unkind father, she was in pain for that application of it to him. Not for herself, so with any trifle of an interlude that was acted, or picture that was shown, or game that was played among them, the occasions for such tenderness towards him were so many that her mind misgave her often it would indeed be better to go back to the old house and live again within the shadow of its dull walls undisturbed. How few who saw sweet Florence in her spring of womanhood, the modest little queen of those small revels, imagined what a load of sacred care lay heavy in her breast. How few of those who stiffened in her father's freezing atmosphere suspected what a heap of fiery coals was piled upon his head. Florence pursued her study patiently, and failing to acquire the secret of the nameless grace she sought among then the youthful company who were assembled in the house, often walked out alone in the early morning among the children of the poor, but still she found them all too advanced to learn from. They had won their household places long ago, and did not stand without as she did with a bar across the door. There was one man whom she several times observed at work very early, and often with a girl of about her own age seated near him. He was a very poor man who seemed to have no regular employment, but now went roaming about the banks of the river when the tide was low, looking out for bits and scraps in the mud, and now worked at the unpromising little patch of garden ground before his cottage, and now tinkered up a miserable old boat that belonged to him, or did some job of that kind for a neighbor as chance occurred. Whatever the man's labor, the girl was never employed, but sat when she was with him in a listless moping state, and idle Florence had often wished to speak to this Man, yet she had never taken courage to do so, as he made no movement towards her. But one morning, when she happened to come upon him suddenly from a bypath among some pollard willows which terminated in the little shelving piece of stony ground that lay between his dwelling and the water, where he was bending over a fire he had made to cork the old boat which was lying bottom upwards close by, he raised his head at the sound of her footstep and gave her good morning, said, "Florence, approaching nearer. You were at work early. I'd be glad to be often at work earlier, miss, if I had work to do." "Is it hard to get?" asked Florence. "I find it so," replied the man. Florence glanced to where the girl was sitting, drawn together with her elbows on her knees and her chin on her hands, and said, "Is that your daughter?" He raised his head quickly and, looking towards the girl with a brightened face, nodded to her and said, "Yes." Florence looked towards her too and gave her a kind salutation. The girl muttered something in return ungraciously and sullenly. "Is she in want of employment also?" said Florence. The man shook his head. "No, miss," he said, "I work for both." "Are there only you two then?" inquired Florence. "Only us two," said the man. "Her mother has been dead these 10 years. Martha." He lifted up his head again and whistled to her. "Won't you say a word to the pretty young lady?" The girl made an impatient gesture with her cowering shoulders and turned her head another way, ugly, misshapen, peevish, ill-conditioned, ragged, dirty, but beloved. "Oh yes." Florence had seen her father's look towards her, and she knew whose look it had no likeness to. "I'm afraid she's worse this morning, my poor girl," said the man, suspending his work and contemplating his ill-favored child with a compassion that was the more tender for being rougher. "She is ill then," said Florence. The man drew a deep sigh. "I don't believe my Martha's had 5 short days good health," he answered, looking at her still. "In as many long years, and more than that, John," said a neighbor who had come down to help him with the boat. "More than that, you say, do you?" cried the other, pushing back his battered hat and drawing his hand across his forehead. "Very like it seems a long time, and the more the time," pursued the neighbor, "the more you favored and humored her, John, till she's got to be a burden to herself and everybody else." "Not to me," said her father, falling to his work. "Not to me." Florence could feel who better. How truly he spoke. She drew a little closer to him and would have been glad to touch his rugged hand and thank him for his goodness to the miserable object that he looked upon with eyes so different from any other man's, who would favor my poor girl. "To call it favoring if I didn't," said the father. I cried the neighbor in reason. "John, but you rob yourself to give to her. You bind yourself hand and foot on her account. You make your life miserable along with her. And what does she care? You don't believe she knows it." The father lifted up his head again and whistled to her. Martha made the same impatient gesture with her crouching shoulders in reply, and he was glad and happy only for that, miss, said the neighbor with a smile in which there was more of secret sympathy than he expressed, "only to get that he never lets her out of his sight, because the day will come, and has been coming a long while," observed the other, bending low over his work, "when to get half as much from that unfortunate child of mine, to get the trembling of a finger or the waving of a hair, would be to raise the dead." Florence softly put some money near his hand on the old boat and left him, and now Florence began to think, if she were to fall ill, if she were to fade like her dear brother, would he then know that she had loved him? Would she then grow dear to him? Would he come to her bedside when she was weak and dim of sight and take her into his embrace and cancel all the past? Would he so forgive her in that changed condition for not having been able to lay open her childish heart to him, as to make it easy to relate with what emotions she had gone out of his room that night, what she had meant to say if she had had the courage, and how she had endeavored afterwards to learn the way she never knew in infancy? Yes, she thought if she were dying he would relent. She thought that if she lay serene and not unwilling to depart upon the bed that was curtained round with recollections of their darling boy, he would be touched home and would say, "Dear Florence, live for me, and we will love each other as we might have done and be as happy as we might have been these many years." She thought that if she heard such words from him and had her arms clasped round him, she could answer with a smile, "It is too late for anything but this. I never could be happier, dear father," and so leave him with a blessing on her lips. The golden water she remembered on the wall appeared to Florence in the light of such reflections only as a current flowing on to rest and to a region where the dear ones gone before were waiting hand in hand, and often when she looked upon the darker river rippling at her feet, she thought, with awful wonder, but not terror, of that river which her brother had so often said was bearing him away. The father and his sick daughter were yet fresh in Florence's mind, and indeed that incident was not a week old when Sabinet and his lady, going out walking in the lanes one afternoon, proposed to her to bear them company. Florence readily consenting, Lady Skettles ordered out young Barnet as a matter of course, for nothing delighted Lady Skettles so much as beholding her eldest son with Florence on his arm. Barnard, to say the truth, appeared to entertain an opposite sentiment on the subject, and on such occasions frequently expressed himself audibly, though indefinitely, in reference to a parcel of girls, as it was not easy to ruffle her sweet temper. However, Florence generally reconciled the young gentleman to his fate after a few minutes, and they strolled on amicably, Lady Skettles and Sabinet following in a state of perfect complacency and high gratification. This was the order of procedure on the afternoon in question, and Florence had almost succeeded in overruling the present objections of Skettles Jr. to his destiny, when a gentleman on horseback came riding by, looked at them earnestly as he passed, drew in his rein, wheeled round, and came riding back again, hat in hand. The gentleman had looked particularly at Florence, and when the little party stopped on his riding back, he bowed to her before saluting Sir Barnet, and his lady Florence had no remembrance of having ever seen him, but she started involuntarily when he came near her and drew back. "My horse is perfectly quiet, I assure you," said the gentleman. It was not that, but something in the gentleman himself. Florence could not have said what that made her recoil as if she had been stung. "I have the honor to address Pistonby, I believe," said the gentleman with a most persuasive smile on Florence. Inclining her head, he added, "My name is Carca, and can hardly hope to be remembered by Miss Tomber except by name Carca." Florence, sensible of a strange inclination to shiver, though the day was hot, presented him to her host and hostess, by whom he was very graciously received. "I beg pardon," said Mr. Cocker 1,000 times, "but I am going down tomorrow morning to Mr. Dombey at Leamington, and if Miss Dombey can entrust me with any commission, need I say how very happy I shall be?" Sabinet, immediately divining that Florence would desire to write a letter to her father, proposed to return, and besought Mr. Parker to come home and dine in his riding gear. Mr. Carr had the misfortune to be engaged to dinner, but if Miss Dombey wished to write, nothing would delight him more than to accompany them back, and to be her faithful slave in waiting as long as she pleased. As he said this, with his widest smile, and bent down close to her to pat his horse's neck, Florence, meeting his eyes, saw rather than heard him say, "There is no news of the ship." Confused, frightened, shrinking from him, and not even sure that he had said those words, for he seemed to have shown them to her in some extraordinary manner through his smile instead of uttering them, Florence faintly said that she was obliged to him, but she would not write. She had nothing to say, nothing to send. "Miss Tomboy," said the man of teeth. "Nothing," said Florence, but my dear love, if you please," disturbed as Florence was, she raised her eyes to his face with an imploring and expressive look that plainly besought him, if he knew, which he as plainly did, that any message between her and her father was an uncommon charge, but that one most of all to spare her. Mr. Carruthers smiled and bowed low, and being charged by Sir Barnard with the best compliments of himself and Lady Skettles, took his leave and rode away, leaving a favorable impression on that worthy couple. Florence was seized with such a shudder as he went that Sabinet, adopting the popular superstition, supposed somebody was passing over her grave. Mr. Carker, turning a corner on the instant, looked back and bowed and disappeared, as if he rode off to the churchyard straight to do it. Chapter 25. Strange news of Uncle Sol. Captain Cuttle, though no sluggard, did not turn out so early on the morning after he had seen Saul Gillies through the shop window writing in the parlor with the midshipman upon the counter, and Rob the grinder making up his bed below it, but that the clock struck 6 as he raised himself on his elbow and took a survey of his little chamber. The captain's eyes must have done severe duty if he usually opened them as wide on awakening as he did that morning, and were but roughly rewarded for their vigilance if he generally rubbed them half as hard. But the occasion was no common one, for Rob the grinder had certainly never stood in the doorway of Captain Cuttle's room before, and in it he stood then, panting at the captain with a flushed and tousled air of bed about him that greatly heightened both his color and expression. "Hello," roared the captain. "What's the matter?" Before Rob could stammer a word in answer, Captain Cuddle turned out all in a heap and covered the boy's mouth with his hand. "Steady, my lad," said the captain. "Don't he speak a word to me yet." The captain, looking at his visitor in great consternation, gently shouldered him into the next room. After laying this injunction upon him and disappearing for a few moments, forthwith returned in the blue suit, holding up his hand in token of the injunction not yet been taken off. Captain Cuddle walked up to the cupboard and poured himself out a dram, a counterpart of which he handed to the messenger. The captain then stood himself up in a corner against the wall, as if to forestall the possibility of being knocked backwards by the communication that was to be made to him, and having swallowed his liquor with his eyes fixed on the messenger, and his face as pale as his face could be, requested him to heave a head. "Do you mean tell you, Captain?" asked Rob, who had been greatly impressed by these precautions. "I," said the captain. "Well, sir," said Rob, "I ain't got much to tell. But look here." Rob produced a bundle of keys. The captain surveyed them, remained in his corner and surveyed the messenger. "And look here," pursued Rob. The boy produced a sealed packet which Captain Cuddle stared at as he had stared at the keys. "When I woke this morning, Captain," said Rob, "which was about 5:15, I found these on my pillow. The shop door was unbolted and unlocked, and Mr. Gill's gone." "Gone?" roared the captain. "Floundered, sir," returned Rob. The captain's voice was so tremendous, and he came out of his corner with such a way on him, that Rob retreated before him into another corner, holding out the keys and packet to prevent himself from being run down. "For Captain Cuddle, sir," cried Rob. "He's on the keys and on the packet too, upon my word and honor, Captain Cuddle. I don't know anything more about it. I wish I may die if I do." "Here's a situation for a lad that's just got a situation," cried the unfortunate grinder, screwing his cuff into his face. His master bolted with his place, and blamed for it. These lamentations had reference to Captain Cuddle's gaze, or rather glare, which was full of vague suspicions, threatenings, and denunciations. Taking the proffered packet from his hand, the captain opened it and read as follows: "My dear Ned Cuddle, enclosed is my will." The captain turned it over with a doubtful look. "And testament? Where's the testament?" said the captain, instantly impeaching the ill-fated grinder. "Have you done with that, my lad?" "I never see it," whimpered Rob. "Don't keep on suspecting an innocent lad, Captain. I never touched the testament." Captain Cuddle shook his head, implying that somebody must be made answerable for it, and gravely proceeded: "Which don't break open for a year, or until you have decisive intelligence of my dear Walter, who is dear to you, Ned, too, I am sure." The captain paused and shook his head in some emotion. Then, as a reestablishment of his dignity in this trying position, looked with exceeding sternness at the grinder. "If you should never hear of me, or see me no more, Ned, remember an old friend, as he will remember you to the last kindly, and at least until the period I have mentioned has expired, keep a home in the old place for Walter. There are no debts. The loan from Dobby's house is paid off, and all my keys I send with this. Keep this quiet and make no inquiry for me. It is useless, so no more, dear Ned, from your true friend Solomon Gills." The captain took a long breath, and then read these words written below: "The boy Rob well recommended, as I told you, from Dobby's house. If all else should come to the hammer, take care, Ned, of the little midshipman, to convey to posterity any idea of the manner in which the captain, after turning this letter over and over, and reading it a score of times, sat down in his chair and held a court-martial on the subject in his own mind, would require the united genius of all the great men who, discarding their own untoward days, have determined to go down to posterity, and have never got there at first." The captain was too much confounded and distressed to think of anything but the letter itself, and even when his thoughts began to glance upon the various attendant facts, they might perhaps as well have occupied themselves with their former theme. For any light they reflected on them in the state of mind Captain Cuddle having the grinder before the court, and no one else, found it a great relief to decide generally that he was an object of suspicion, which the captain so clearly expressed in his visage that Rob remonstrated. "Oh, don't, Captain," cried the grinder. "I wonder how you can. What have I done to be looked at like that, my lad?" said Captain Cuddle. "Don't you sing out afore you are hurt, and don't you commit yourself. Whatever you do, I haven't been uncommitted." "Nothing," Captain answered. Rob, keep her free, then said the captain impressively, and ride easy, with the deep sense of the responsibility imposed upon him, and the necessity of thoroughly fathoming this mysterious affair as became a man and his relations with the party's captain. Cuddle resolved to go down and examine the premises, and to keep the grinder with him, considering that youth is under arrest at present. The captain was in some doubt whether it might not be expedient to handcuff him or tie his ankles together, or attach a weight to his legs, but not being clear as to the legality of such formalities, the captain decided merely to hold him by the shoulder all the way and knock him down if he made any objection. However, he made none, and consequently got to the instrument maker's house without being placed under any more stringent restraint. As the shutters were not yet taken down, the captain's first care was to have the shop opened, and when the daylight was freely admitted, he proceeded with its aid to further investigation. The captain's first care was to establish himself in a chair in the shop as president of the solemn tribunal that was sitting within him, and to require Rob to lie down in his bed under the counter, show exactly where he discovered the keys and packet, when he awoke how he found the door, and when he went to try it how he started off to Brig Place, cautiously preventing the latter imitation from being carried farther than the threshold, and so on to the end of the chapter. When all this had been done several times, the captain shook his head and seemed to think the matter had a bad look. Next, the captain, with some indistinct idea of finding a body, instituted a strict search over the whole house, groping in the cellars with a lighted candle, thrusting his hook behind doors, bringing his head into violent contact with beams, and covering himself with cobwebs. Mounting up to the old man's bedroom, they found he had not been in bed on the previous night, but had merely lain down on the coverlet, as was evident from the impression yet remaining there. "And I think, Captain," said Rob, looking round the room, "that when Mr. Gills was going in and out so often these last few days, he was taking little things away piecemeal, not to attract attention." Said the captain mysteriously. "Why so, my lad, why?" returned Rob, looking about. "I don't see his shaving tackle, nor his brushes, Captain, nor his shirts, nor yet his shoes, as each of these articles was mentioned." Captain Cuddle took particular notice of the corresponding department of the grinder, lest he should appear to have been in recent use, or should prove to be in present possession thereof. But Rob had no occasion to shave, was not brushed, and wore the clothes he had worn for a long time past, beyond all possibility of a mistake. "And what should you say," said the captain, "not committing yourself about his time of shearing off, eh?" "Why, I think, Captain," returned Rob, "that he must have gone pretty soon after I began to snore." "What o'clock was that?" said the captain, prepared to be very particular about the exact time. "How can I tell, Captain?" answered Rob. "I only know that I'm a heavy sleeper at first, and a light one towards morning. And if Mr. Gillies had come through the shop near daybreak, though ever so much on tiptoe, I'm pretty sure I should have heard him shut the door. At all events, on mature consideration of this evidence, Captain Cuddle began to think that the instrument maker must have vanished of his own accord, to which logical conclusion he was assisted by the letter addressed to himself, which, as being undeniably in the old man's handwriting, would seem, with no great forcing to bear the construction, that he arranged of his own will to go. And so went. The captain had next to consider where and why, and as there was no way whatsoever that he saw to the solution of the first difficulty, he confined his meditations to the second, remembering the old man's curious manner, and the farewell he had taken of him, unaccountably fervent at the time, but quite intelligible now. A terrible apprehension strengthened on the captain, that, overpowered by his anxieties and regrets for Walter, he had been driven to commit suicide, unequal to the wear and tear of daily life, as he had often professed himself to be, and shaken, as he no doubt was, by the uncertainty and deferred hope he had undergone. It seemed no violently strained misgiving, but only too probable. Free from debt, and with no fear for his personal liberty or the seizure of his goods, what else but such a state of madness could have hurried him away alone and secretly? As to his carrying some apparel with him, if he had really done so, and they were not even sure of that he might have done so, the captain argued, to prevent inquiry, to distract attention from his probable fate, or to ease the very mind that was now revolving all these possibilities. Such, reduced into plain language and condensed within a small compass, was the final result in substance of Captain Cuddle's deliberations, which took a long time to arrive at this pass, and were like some more public deliberations, very discursive and disorderly, dejected and despondent in the extreme. Captain Cuttle felt it just to release Rob from the arrest in which he had placed him and to enlarge him subject to a kind of honorable inspection, which he still resolved to exercise, and having hired a man from Brogley, the broker, to sit in the shop during their absence, the captain, taking Rob with him, issued forth upon a dismal quest after the mortal remains of Solomon Gills. Not a station house or bone house or workhouse in the metropolis escaped a visitation from the hard glaze had along the wharfs, among the shipping on the bank side, up the river, down the river, here, there, everywhere it went gleaming, where men were thickest like the hero's helmet in an epic battle. For a whole week the captain read of all the found and missing people in all the newspapers and handbills, and went forth on expeditions at all hours of the day to identify Solomon Gills in poor little shipboys who had fallen overboard, and in tall foreigners with dark beards who had taken poison. To make sure, Captain Cuttle said that it weren't him. It is a sure thing that it never was, and that the good captain had no other satisfaction. Captain Cuttle at last abandoned these attempts as hopeless, and set himself to consider what was to be done next. After several new perusals of his poor friend's letter, he considered that the maintenance of a home in the old place for Walter was the primary duty imposed upon him. Therefore the captain's decision was that he would keep house on the premises of Solomon Gills himself, and would go into the instrument business and see what came of it. But as this step involved the relinquishment of his apartments at Mrs. McStinger's, and he knew that resolute woman would never hear of his deserting them, the captain took the desperate determination of running away. Now look here, my lad, said the captain to Rob, when he had matured this notable scheme, tomorrow I shan't be found in this here roadstead till night, not till after midnight, perhaps, but you keep watch till you hear me knock, and the moment you do, turn to and open the door. Very good, captain, said Rob. You'll continue to be rated on these year books, pursued the captain condescendingly, and I don't say but what you may get a promotion if you and me should pull together with a will. But the moment you hear me knock tomorrow night, whatever time it is, turn to and show yourself smart with the door. I'll be sure to do it, captain, replied Rob. Because you understand, resumed the captain, coming back again to enforce this charge upon his mind, there may be, for anything I can say, a chase, and I might be took while I was waiting if you didn't show yourself smart with the door. Rob again assured the captain that he would be prompt and wakeful, and the captain, having made this prudent arrangement, went home to Mrs. McStinger's for the last time. The sense the captain had of its being the last time, and of the awful purpose hidden beneath his blue waistcoat, inspired him with such a mortal dread of Mrs. McStinger that the sound of that lady's foot downstairs at any time of the day was sufficient to throw him into a fit of trembling. It fell out to that Mrs. McStinger was in a charming temper, mild and placid as a house lamb, and Captain Cuttle's conscience suffered terrible twinges when she came up to inquire if she could cook him nothing for his dinner, a nice small kidney pudding. Now Captain Cuttle, said his landlady, or sheep's heart don't mind my trouble. No thank you, ma'am, returned the captain. Have a roast fowl, said Mrs. McStinger, with a bit of wool stuffing and some egg sauce. Come, Captain Cuttle, give yourself a little treat. No thank you, marm, returned the captain very humbly. I'm sure you're out of sorts and want to be stimulated, said Mrs. McStinger. Why not have for once in a way a bottle of cherry wine? Well, ma'am, rejoined the captain, if you be so good as to take a glass or two, I think I would try that. Would you do me the favor, ma'am, said the captain, torn to pieces by his conscience, to accept the quarter's rent ahead? And why so, Captain Cuttle, retorted Mrs. McStinger sharply, as the captain thought the captain was frightened to death. If you would, ma'am, he said with submission, it would oblige me. I can keep my money very well. It pays itself out. I should take it kind if you'd comply. Well, Captain Cull, said the unconscious McStinger, rubbing her hands, you can do as you please. It's not for me with my family to refuse no more than it is to ask. And would you, marm, said the captain, taking down the tin canister in which he kept his cash from the top shelf of the cupboard base, or gold is to offer 18 pence apiece to the little family all round, if you could make a convenient mom to pass the word presently for them children to come forward in a body. I should be glad to see him. These innocent mucksters were so many daggers to the captain's breast when they appeared in a swarm and tore at him with a confiding trustfulness. he so little deserved the eye of Alexander McStinger. Who had been his favorite was insupportable to the captain. The voice of Juliana McStinger, who was the picture of her mother, made a coward of him. Captain Cuttle kept up appearances nevertheless tolerably well, and for an hour or two was very hardly used and roughly handled by the young mucksters, who in their childish frolics did a little damage also to the glazed hat by sitting in it two at a time as in a nest and drumming on the inside of the crown with their shoes at length. The captain sorrowfully dismissed them, taking leave of these cherubs with a poignant remorse and grief of a man who was going to execution in the silence of night. The captain packed up his heavier property in a chest, which he locked, intending to leave it there in all probability forever. But on the forlorn chance of one day finding a man sufficiently bold and desperate to come and ask for it of his lighter necessities, the captain made a bundle and disposed his plate about his person ready for flight. At the hour of midnight, when Brig Place was buried in slumber and Mrs. McStinger was lulled in sweet oblivion, with her infants around her, the guilty captain, stealing down on tiptoe in the dark, opened the door, closed it softly after him, and took to his heels, pursued by the image of Mrs. McStinger, springing out of bed, and regardless of costume following and bringing him back, pursued also by a consciousness of his enormous crime. Captain Cuttle held on at a great pace and allowed no grass to grow under his feet between Brig Place and the instrument maker's door. It opened when he knocked, for Rob was on the watch, and when it was bolted and locked behind him, Captain Cuttle felt comparatively safe. "Phew," cried the captain, looking round him. "It's a breather. Nothing the matter, is there, Captain?" cried the gaping Rob. "No, no," said Captain Cuttle, after changing color and listening to a passing footstep in the street. "But Mindy, my lad, if any lady except either of them two, as you see t'other day, ever comes and asks for Cat and Cuttle, be sure to report no person of that name known, nor never heard of here. Observe them orders, will you?" "I'll take care, Captain," returned Rob. "You might say, if you liked," hesitated the captain, "that you read in the paper that a captain of that name was gone to Australia, emigrating along with the old ship's complement of people, as had all swore never to come back no more." Rob nodded his understanding of these instructions, and Captain Cuttle, promising to make a man of him if he obeyed orders, dismissed him yawning to his bed under the counter, and went aloft to the chamber of Solomon Gills. What the captain suffered next day whenever a bonnet passed, or how often he darted out of the shop to elude imaginary mustaches and sought safety in the attic, cannot be told. But to avoid the fatigues attendant on this means of self-preservation, the captain curtained the glass door of communication between the shop and parlor on the inside, fitted a key to it from the bunch that had been sent to him, and cut a small hole of a spindle in the wall. The advantage of this fortification is obvious. On a bonnet appearing, the captain instantly slipped into his garrison, locked himself up, and took a secret observation of the enemy. Finding it a false alarm, the captain instantly slipped out again, and the bonnets in the street were so very numerous, and alarms were so inseparable from their appearance, that the captain was almost incessantly slipping in and out all day long. Captain Cuttle found time, however, in the midst of this fatiguing service, to inspect the stock in connection with which he had the general idea, very laborious to Rob, that too much friction could not be bestowed upon it, and that it could not be made to bright. He also ticketed a few attractive-looking articles at adventure at prices ranging from 10 shillings to £50, and exposed them in the window to the great astonishment of the public. After effecting these improvements, Captain Cuttle, surrounded by the instruments, began to feel scientific, and looked up at the stars at night through the skylight when he was smoking his pipe in the little back parlor before going to bed. As if he had established a kind of property in them as a tradesman in the city too, he began to have an interest in the Lord Mayor and the sheriffs and in public companies, and felt bound to read the quotations of the funds every day, though he was unable to make out on any principle of navigation what the figures meant, and could very well have dispensed with the fractions. Florence, the captain, waited on with his strange news of Uncle Saul immediately after taking possession of the midshipman. But she was away from home, so the captain sat himself down in his altered station of life, with no company but Rob the grinder, and losing count of time, as men do when great changes come upon them, thought musingly of Walter, and of Solomon Gills, and even of Mrs. McStinger herself. As among the things that had been Chapter 26 shadows of the past and future, your most obedient, sir, said the Major. Damn. It's sir, a friend of my friend Dambas is a friend of mine, and I'm glad to see you. I am infinitely obliged, Carker explained Mr. Dumby to Major Bagstock for his company and conversation. Major Bagstock has rendered me great service, Carker. Mr. Parker, the manager, hat in hand, just arrived at Leamington and just introduced to the Major, showed the Major his whole double range of teeth and trusted he might take the liberty of thanking him with all his heart for having effected so great an improvement in Mr. Dombey's looks and spirits. By God, sir, said the Major in reply, there are no thanks due to me, for it's a give and take affair. A great creature like our friend Dombey, sir, said the Major, lowering his voice, but not lowering it so much as to render it inaudible. To that gentleman cannot help improving and exalting his friends. He strengthens and invigorates a man's as Danby in his moral nature. Mr. Karras snapped at the expression in his moral nature, exactly the very words he had been on the point of suggesting. But when my friend Dombey, sir, added the Major talks to you of Major Bagstock, I must crave leave to set him, and you right he means plain Joe, sir, Joey B. Josh Bagstock, Joseph Ruff, and tough old J, sir, at your service. Mr. Carker's excessively friendly inclinations towards the Major and Mr. Carker's admiration of his roughness, toughness, and plainness gleamed out of every tooth in Mr. Carker's head. And now, sir, said the Major, you and Dombey have the devil's own amount of business to talk over. By no means, Major, observed Mr. Dobby, said the Major defiantly. I know better, a man of your mark, the Colossus of Commerce, is not to be interrupted. Your moments are precious. We shall meet at dinner time. In the interval, old Joseph will be scarce. The dinner hour is a sharp 7, Mr. Carr. With that, the Major, greatly swollen as to his face, withdrew, but immediately putting in his head at the door again, said, I beg your pardon. Dobby, have you any message to him? Mr. Dombey, in some embarrassment, and not without a glance at the courteous keeper of his business confidence, entrusted the Major with his compliments. By the Lord, sir, said the Major, you must make it something warmer than that, or old Joe will be far from welcome. Regards, then, if you will, Major, returned Mr. Tolby. Damn it, sir, said the Major, shaking his shoulders and his great cheeks jocularly. Make it something warmer than that, what you please, then. Major, observed Mr. Dombey, our friend is sly, sir. Sly lies, a devilish lie, said the Major, staring round the door at Carker. So is Bagstock, but stopping in the midst of a chuckle and drawing himself up to his full height, the Major solemnly exclaimed, as he struck himself on the chest, don't be, I envy your feelings, God bless you, and withdrew. You must have found the gentleman a great resource, said Carker, following him with his teeth. Very great indeed, said Mr. Dombey. He has friends here, no doubt, pursued Carker. I perceive from what he has said that you go into society here. Do you know, smiling horribly, I am so very glad that you go into society. Mr. Dombey acknowledged this display of interest on the part of his second in command by twirling his watch chain and slightly moving his head. You were formed for society, said Carker. Of all the men I know, you are the best adapted by nature and by position for society. Do you know, I have been frequently amazed that you should have held it at arm's length so long. I have had my reasons, Carker. I have been alone and indifferent to it, but you have great social qualifications yourself, and are the more likely to have been surprised. Oh, I returned the other with ready self-disparagement. It's quite another matter in the case of a man like me. I don't come into comparison with you. Mr. Dombey put his hand to his neckcloth, settled his chin in it, coughed, and stood looking at his faithful friend and servant for a few moments. In silence. I shall have the pleasure, Cargar, said Mr. Dombey at length, making as if he swallowed something a little too large for his throat, to present you to the Major's friends, highly agreeable people, ladies among them, I presume, insinuated the smooth manager. They are all, and that is to say, they are both ladies, replied Mr. Dombey. Only to, smiled Carker. There are only 2. I have confined my visits to their residence, and have made no other acquaintance here. Sisters, perhaps, quoth Carker. Mother and daughter, replied Mr. Dombey, as Mr. Dombey dropped his eyes and adjusted his neckcloth again. The smiling face of Mr. Parker, the manager, became, in a moment, and without any stage of transition, transformed into a most intent and frowning face, scanning his closely, and with an ugly sneer. As Mr. Dombey raised his eyes, it changed back no less quickly to its old expression, and showed him every gum of which it stood possessed. "You are very kind," said Carker, "I shall be delighted to know them. Speaking of daughters, I have seen Miss Dombey." There was a sudden rush of blood to Mr. Dombey's face. "I took the liberty of waiting on her," said Cocker, "to inquire if she would charge me with any little commission. I am not so fortunate as to be the bearer of any but her dear love." Wolf's face. It was then with even the hot tongue revealing itself through the stretched mouth as the eyes encountered Mr. Dombey's. "What business intelligence is there?" inquired the latter gentleman after a silence during which Mr. Parker had produced some memoranda and other papers. "There is very little," returned Cocker. "Upon the hill we have not had our usual good fortune of late, but that is of little moment to you at Lloyd's. They give up the son and heir for lost. Well, she was insured from her keel to her masthead." "Carker," said Mr. Dombey, taking a chair near him, "I cannot say that young man Gay ever impressed me favorably, nor may," interposed the manager. "But I wish," said Mr. Dombey without heeding the interruption, "he had never gone on board that ship. I wish he had never been sent out. It is a pity you didn't say so in good time, is it not?" retorted Kafka coolly. "However, I think it's all for the best. I really think it's all for the best that I mention that." There was something like a little confidence between Miss Dombey and myself. "No," said Mr. Dombey sternly. "I have no doubt," returned Mr. Karkoff with an impressive pause, "that whatever Gay is, he is much better where he is than at home here. If I were or could be in your place, I should be satisfied of that. I am quite satisfied of it myself." Miss Tomboy is confiding and young, perhaps hardly proud enough for your daughter, if she have a fault not. That it is much, though I am sure. Will you check these balances with me?" Mr. Dombey leaned back in his chair instead of bending over the papers that were laid before him and looked the manager steadily in the face. The manager, with his eyelids slightly raised, affected to be glancing at his figures and to await the leisure of his principal. He showed that he affected this as if from great delicacy and with a design to spare Mr. Dombey's feelings, and the latter, as he looked at him, was cognizant of his intended consideration and felt that, but for it, this confidential Kaka would have said a great deal more, which he, Mr. Dombey, was too proud to ask for. It was his way in business. Often, little by little, Mr. Dombey's gaze relaxed and his attention became diverted to the papers before him. But while busy with the occupation they afforded him, he frequently stopped and looked at Mr. Parker again. Whenever he did so, Mr. Parker was demonstrative as before in his delicacy, and impressed it on his great chief more and more while they were thus engaged. And under the skillful culture of the manager, angry thoughts in reference to poor Florence brooded and bred in Mr. Dombey's breast, usurping the place of the cold dislike that generally reigned there. Major Bagstock, much admired by the old ladies of Leamington, and followed by the native carrying the usual amount of light baggage, straddled along the shady side of the way to make a morning call on Mrs. Scutton. It being midday when the Major reached the bower of Cleopatra, he had the good fortune to find his princess on her usual sofa, languishing over a cup of coffee, with the room so darkened and shaded for her more luxurious repose that Withers, who was in attendance on her, loomed like a phantom page. "What insupportable creature is this coming in?" said Mrs. Scutton. "I cannot bear it. Go away, whoever you are. You have not the heart to banish J.B. Mom," said the Major, halting midway to remonstrate with his cane over his shoulder. "It's you, is it? On second thoughts, you may enter," observed Cleopatra. The Major entered accordingly, and advancing to the sofa, pressed her charming hand to his lips. "Sit down," said Cleopatra, listlessly waving her fan. "A long way off. Don't come too near me, for I am frightfully faint and sensitive this morning, and you smell of the sun. You are absolutely tropical. By George, ma'am," said the Major, "the time has been when Joseph Bagstock has been grilled and blistered by the sun. Then time was when he was forced, ma'am, into such full blow by high hothouse heat in the West Indies that he was known as the Flower. A man never heard of Bagstock, ma'am. In those days he heard of the flower of ours. The flower may have faded more or less, ma'am," observed the Major, dropping into a much nearer chair than had been indicated by his cruel divinity. "But it is a tough plant yet, and constant as the evergreen." Here the Major, under cover of the dark room, shut up one eye, rolled his head like a harlequin, and in his great self-satisfaction perhaps went nearer to the confines of apoplexy than he had ever gone before. "Where's Mrs. Granger?" inquired Cleopatra of her page. Withers believed she was in her own room very well, said Mrs. Scutton. Go away and shut the door. I am engaged. As Withers disappeared, Mrs. Scutton turned her head languidly towards the Major, without otherwise moving, and asked him how his friend was. Dombey, ma'am, returned the Major, with a facetious gurgling in his throat, is as well as a man in his condition can be. His condition is a desperate one, ma'am. He has touched his Dumbear. Touched, cried the Major. He is bayoneted through the body. Cleopatra cast a sharp look at the Major that contrasted forcibly with the affected drawl in which he presently said, Major Bagstock, although I know but little of the world, nor can I really regret my experience, for I fear it is a false place full of withering conventionalities where nature is but little regarded, and where the music of the heart and the gushing of the soul and all that sort of thing which is so truly poetical is seldom heard. I cannot misunderstand your meaning. There is an allusion to Edith, to my extremely dear child, said Mrs. Scutton, tracing the outline of her eyebrows with her forefinger. In your words, to which the tenderest of chords vibrates, excessively bluntness, ma'am, returned the Major, has ever been the characteristic of the Bagstock breed. You are right, Joe admits it, and that allusion, pursued Cleopatra, would involve one of the most, if not positively the most touching and thrilling and sacred emotions of which our sadly fallen nature is susceptible. I conceive. The Major laid his hand upon his lips and wafted a kiss to Cleopatra, as if to identify the emotion in question. I feel that I am weak. I feel that I am wanting in that energy which should sustain a mamma, not to say a parent, on such a subject, sobbed Mrs. Scutton, trimming her lips with the laced edge of her pocket handkerchief. But I can hardly approach a topic so excessively momentous to my dearest Edith without feeling a faintness. Nevertheless, bad man, as you have boldly remarked upon it, and as it has occasioned me great anguish. Mrs. Scutton touched her left side with her fan. I will not shrink from my duty. The Major, under cover of the dimness, swelled and rolled his purple face about and winked his lobster eye until he fell into a fit of wheezing, which obliged him to rise and take a turn or two about the room before his fair friend could proceed. Mr. Dombey, said Mrs. Scutton, when she at length resumed, was obliging enough now many weeks ago to do us the honor of visiting us here in company. My dear Major, with yourself I acknowledge, let me be open, that it is my failing to be the creature of impulse, and to wear my heart as it were outside. I know my failing full well. My enemy cannot know it better, but I am not penitent. I would rather not be frozen by the heartless world, and I am content to bear this imputation justly. Mrs. Scutton arranged her tucker, pinched her wiry throat to give it a soft surface, and went on with great complacency. It gave me, my dearest Edith, to I am sure infinite pleasure, to receive Mr. Dombey as a friend of yours. My dear Major, we were naturally disposed to be prepossessed in his favor, and I fancied that I observed an amount of heart in Mr. Dombey that was excessively refreshing. There is devilish little heart in Dombey now, ma'am, said the Major. Wretched man, cried Mrs. Scutton, looking at him languidly. Pray be silent. JB is dumb, ma'am, said the Major. Mr. Dome, pursued Cleopatra, smoothing the rosy hue upon her cheeks, accordingly repeated his visit, and possibly finding some attraction in the simplicity and primness of artists, for there is always a charm in nature. It is so very sweet, became one of our little circle every evening. Little did I think of the awful responsibility into which I plunged when I encouraged Mr. Dumbear to beat up these quarters. Ma'am, suggested Major Bagstock. Coarse person, said Mrs. Stewart. You anticipate my meaning, though, in odious language. Here Mrs. Scutton rested her elbow on the little table at her side, and suffering her wrist to droop in what she considered a graceful and becoming manner, dangled her fan to and fro and lazily admired her hand while speaking. The agony I have endured, she said mincingly, as the truth has by degrees dawned upon me, has been too exceedingly terrific to dilate upon my whole existence, is bound up in my sweetest Edith, and to see her change from day to day, my beautiful pet, who has positively garnered up her heart since the death of that most delightful creature Granger, is the most affecting thing in the world. Mrs. Scutton's world was not a very trying one, if one might judge of it by the influence of its most affecting circumstance upon her. But this, by the way, Edith, simpered Mrs. Scutton, who is the perfect pearl of my life, is said to resemble me. I believe we are alike. There is one man in the world who never will admit that anyone resembles you, Mom, said the Major, and that man's name is old Joe Bagstock. Cleopatra made as if she would brain the flatterer with her fan, but relenting smiled upon him and proceeded, if my charming girl inherits any advantages from me, wicked one, the major was the wicked one, she inherits also my foolish nature she has. Great force of character mine has been said to be immense, though I don't believe it. But once moved she is susceptible and sensitive to the last extent. What are my feelings? When I see her pining they destroy me. The major, advancing his double chin and pursing up his blue lips into a soothing expression, affected the profoundest sympathy, the confidence, said Mrs. Scutton, that has subsisted between us. The free development of soul and openness of sentiment is touching to think of. We have been more like sisters than mama and child. JB's own sentiment, observed the major, expressed by JB 50,000 times. Do not interrupt, rude man, said Cleopatra. What are my feelings then, when I find that there is one subject avoided by us, that there is a what's his name, a gulf opened between us, that my own artless Edith is changed to me? They are of the most poignant description. Of course the major left his chair and took one nearer to the little table. From day to day I see this, my dear major, proceeded Mrs. Scutton. From day to day I feel this, from hour to hour I reproach myself for that excessive faith and trustfulness which has led to such distressing consequences, and almost from minute to minute I hope that Mr. Dobby may explain himself and relieve the torture I undergo, which is extremely wearing. But nothing happens, my dear major. I am the slave of remorse. Take care of the coffee cup. You are so very awkward. My darling Edith is an altered being, and I really don't see what is to be done, or what good creature I can advise. With Major Bagstock, encouraged perhaps by the softened and confidential tone into which Mrs. Scutton, after several times lapsing into it for the moment, seemed now to have subsided for good, stretched out his hand across the little table and said with a leer, advise with Joe, ma'am. Then you aggravating monster, sighed Cleopatra, giving one hand to the major and tapping his knuckles with her fan, which she held in the other. Why don't you talk to me? You know what I mean. Why don't you tell me something to the purpose? The major laughed and kissed the hand she had bestowed upon him, and laughed again immensely. Is there as much heart in Mr. Dombey as I gave him credit for? Languished. You talk to me, you know what I mean. Why don't you tell me something to the purpose? The major laughed and kissed the hand she had bestowed upon him, and laughed again immensely. Is there as much heart in Mr. Dombey as I gave him credit for? Languished. Cleopatra tenderly, do you think he is in earnest, my dear major? Would you recommend his being spoken to or his being left alone? Now tell me like a dear man, what would you advise? Shall we marry him to Edith Granger? Maham, chuckled the major hoarsely. Mysterious creature, returned Cleopatra, bringing her fan to bed upon the major's nose. How can we marry him? Shall we marry him to Edith Granger, mom, I say, chuckled the major again. Mrs. Scutton returned no answer in words, but smiled upon the major with so much archness and vivacity that gallant officer, considering himself challenged, would have imprinted a kiss on her exceedingly red lips. But for her interposing the fan with a very winning and juvenile dexterity, it might have been in modesty. It might have been in apprehension of some danger to their bloom. Don't be mum, said the major. Is a great cacho mercenary wretch, cried Clear Parker with a little shriek. I am shocked, and Dobby, ma'am, pursued the major, thrusting forward his head and distending his eyes. Is in earnest, Joseph says it. Bagstock knows it. JB keeps him to the mark. Leave Dombey to himself, ma'am. Dombey is safe, ma'am. Do as you have done, do no more, and trust JB for the end. You really think so, my dear major? Returned Cleopatra, who had eyed him very cautiously and very searchingly in spite of her listless bearing. Sure of it, ma'am, rejoined the major. Cleopatra, the pearls and her Aunt Antony Bagstock will often speak of this triumphantly when sharing the elegance and wealth of Edith Dombey's establishment. Dombey's right-hand man, ma'am, said the major, stopping abruptly in a chuckle and becoming serious, has arrived this morning, said Cleopatra. This morning, ma'am, returned the major, and Dombey's anxiety for his and wealth of Edith Dombey's establishment. Dombey's right-hand man, ma'am, said the major, stopping abruptly in a chuckle and becoming serious, has arrived this morning, said Cleopatra. This morning, ma'am, returned the major, and Dombey's anxiety for his arrival, ma'am, is to be referred. Take JB's word for theirs, for Joe is devilish sly. The major tapped his nose and screwed up one of his eyes tight, which did not enhance his native beauty, to his desire that what is in the wind is to be referred. Take JB's word for theirs, for Joe is devilish sly. The major tapped his nose and screwed up one of his eyes tight, which did not enhance his native beauty, to his desire that what is in the wind should become known to him, without Dobby's telling, and consulting him, for Dobby is as proud a mom as Lucifer, a charming quality, lisped Mrs. Scutton, reminding one of dearest Edith. Well, ma'am, said the Major, I have thrown out hints already, and the right-hand man understands them, and Dobby's telling, and consulting him, for Dobby is as proud a mom as Lucifer, a charming quality, lisped Mrs. Scutton, reminding one of dearest Edith. Well, ma'am, said the Major, I have thrown out hints already, and the right-hand man understands them, and I'll throw out more before the day is done. Dombey projected this morning a ride to Warwick Castle, and to Kenilworth tomorrow, to be preceded by a breakfast with us. I undertook the delivery of this invitation, for the day is done. Dombey projected this morning a ride to Warwick Castle, and to Kenilworth tomorrow, to be preceded by a breakfast with us. I undertook the delivery of this invitation. Will you honor us so, Harmarm? Said the Major, swelling with shortness of breath and slyness as he produced a note addressed to the Honorable Mrs. Scutton, by favor of Major Bagstock, wherein hers ever faithfully Paul Dombey besought her and her amiable and accomplished daughter to consent to the proposed excursion, and in a postscript, and to which the same ever faithful to the Honorable Mrs. Scutton, by favor of Major Bagstock, wherein hers ever faithfully Paul Dombey besought her and her amiable and accomplished daughter to consent to the proposed excursion, and in a postscript, and to which the same ever faithfully Paul Dombey entreated to be recalled to the remembrance of Mrs. Granger. Hush, said Cleopatra suddenly. Edith, the entreated to be recalled to the remembrance of Mrs. Granger. Hush, said Cleopatra suddenly. Edith, the loving mother, can scarcely be described as resuming her insipid and affected air when she made this exclamation, for she had never cast it off, nor was it likely that she ever would or could in any other place than in the grave. But how dearly dismissing whatever shadow of earnestness or faint confession of her insipid and affected air when she made this exclamation, for she had never cast it off, nor was it likely that she ever would or could in any other place than in the grave. But how dearly dismissing whatever shadow of earnestness or faint confession of a purpose laudable or wicked that her face or voice or manner had for the moment betrayed, she lounged upon the couch, her most insipid and most languid self again, as Edith entered the or wicked that her face or voice or manner had for the moment betrayed, she lounged upon the couch, her most insipid and most languid self again, as Edith entered the room. Edith, so beautiful and stately, but so cold and so repelling, who was slightly acknowledging the presence of Major Bagstock, and directing a keen glance at her mother, drew back the curtain from a window and sat down there looking out. My dearest Edith, said Mrs. Scutton, where on earth have you been? I have wanted you, my love, most sadly. You said you were engaged, and I stayed away, she answered, without turning her head. It was cruel to old Joe, ma'am, said the Major in his gallantry. It was very cruel, I know, she said, still looking out, and said with such calm disdain that the Major was discomforted and could think of nothing in reply. Major Bagstock, my darling Edith, drawled her mother, who is generally the most useless and disagreeable creature in the world, as you know. It is surely not worthwhile. Mamma, said Edith, looking round to observe these forms of speech. We are quite alone. We know each other. The quiet scorn that sat upon her handsome face, a scorn, agreeable creature in the world, as you know. It is surely not worthwhile. Mamma, said Edith, looking round to observe these forms of speech. We are quite alone. We know each other. The quiet scorn that sat upon her handsome face, a scorn that evidently lighted on herself no less than them, was so intense and deep that her mother's simper, for the instant though of a hardy constitution, drooped before it. My darling girl, she began again. Not woman yet, said Edith with a smile. How very odd you are today, my dear. Pray let me say, my love, that Major Bagstock has brought the kindest. At her mother's simper, for the instant though of a hardy constitution, drooped before it. My darling girl, she began again. Not woman yet, said Edith with a smile. How very odd you are today, my dear. Pray let me say, my love, that Major Bagstock has brought the kindest of notes from Mr. Dambo, proposing that we should breakfast with him tomorrow and ride to Warwick and Kenilworth. Will you go? Edith, will I go? She repeated, turning very red. Mr. Dambo proposing that we should breakfast with him tomorrow and ride to Warwick and Kenilworth. Will you go? Edith, will I go? She repeated, turning very red and breathing quickly as she looked round at her mother. I knew you would. My own observed the latter carelessly. It is, as you say, quite a form to ask. Here is Mr. Dombrey's letter. Edith, thank you. I have no desire to read it, was her answer. Then perhaps I'd better answer it myself, said Mrs. Scrivener, though. I had thought of asking you to be my secretary, darling. As Edith made no movement and no answer, Mrs. Scutton begged the Major to wheel. Edith, thank you. I have no desire to read it, was her answer. Then perhaps I'd better answer it myself, said Mrs. Scrivener, though. I had thought of asking you to be my secretary, darling. As Edith made no movement and no answer, Mrs. Scutton begged the Major to wheel her little table nearer and to set open the desk it contained, and to take out pen and paper for her, all which congenial offices of gallantry the Major discharged with much submission and devotion. Your regards, Edith, my dear, said Mrs. Scutton, pausing, pen in hand, at the postscript. What you? Well, Mamma, she answered, without turning her head, and with supreme indifference. Mrs. Scutton wrote what she would, without seeking for any more explicit directions, and handed her letter to the Major, who, receiving it as a precious charge, may hand at the postscript. What you? Well, Mamma, she answered, without turning her head, and with supreme indifference. Mrs. Scutton wrote what she would, without seeking for any more explicit directions, and handed her letter to the Major, who, receiving it as a precious charge, made a show of laying it near his heart, but was fain to put it in the pocket of his pantaloons on account of the insecurity of his waistcoat. The Major then took a very polished and chivalrous farewell of both ladies, which the elder one acknowledged in her usual manner, while the younger, sitting with her face addressed to the window, bent her head so slightly that it would have been a greater compliment to the Major to have made no sign at all, and to have left him to infer that he had not been. Younger, sitting with her face addressed to the window, bent her head so slightly that it would have been a greater compliment to the Major to have made no sign at all, and to have left him to infer that he had not been heard or thought of. As to alteration and has amused the Major on his way back, on which expedition, the afternoon being sunny and hot, he ordered the native and the light baggage to the front, and walked in the shadow of that expatriated prince. As to alteration, sir, and as to alteration and has amused the Major on his way back, on which expedition, the afternoon being sunny and hot, he ordered the native and the light baggage to the front, and walked in the shadow of that expatriated prince. As to alteration, sir, and pinning, and so forth, that won't go down with Joseph Bagstock. None of that, sir, it won't do here. But as to there being something of a division between or a gulf, as the mother calls it, damn it, sir, that seems true enough, and so forth, that won't go down with Joseph Bagstock. None of that, sir, it won't do here. But as to there being something of a division between or a gulf, as the mother calls it, damn it, sir, that seems true enough, and it's odd enough. Well, sir, panted the Major, Edith Granger and Donbier are well matched. Let them fight it out. Bagstock backs the winner. The Major, by saying these latter words aloud in the vigor of his thoughts, caused the unhappy native to stop and turn around in the belief that he was personally addressed. Exasperated to the last degree by this act of insubordination, the Major, though he was swelling with enjoyment of his own humor, aloud in the vigor of his thoughts, caused the unhappy native to stop and turn around in the belief that he was personally addressed. Exasperated to the last degree by this act of insubordination, the Major, though he was swelling with enjoyment of his own humor at the moment of its occurrence, instantly thrust his cane among the native's ribs, and continued to stir him up at short intervals all the way to the hotel. Nor was the Major less exasperated as he dressed for dinner, during which operation the dark servant underwent the pelting of a shower of miscellaneous objects varying in size from a boot to a hairbrush, and including everything that came within his master's reach. For was the Major less exasperated as he dressed for dinner, during which operation the dark servant underwent the pelting of a shower of miscellaneous objects varying in size from a boot to a hairbrush, and including everything that came within his master's reach. For the Major plumed himself on having the native in a perfect state of drill, and visited the least departure from strict discipline. With this kind of fatigue duty, add to this that he maintained the native about his person as a counter-irritant against the gout and all other vexations, mental as well as bodily, and the native would appear to have earned his pay, which was not large. At length, the Major, having disposed of all the missiles that were convenient to his hand, and having called the as a counter-irritant against the gout and all other vexations, mental as well as bodily, and the native would appear to have earned his pay, which was not large at length, the major having disposed of all the missiles that were convenient to his hand, and having called the native so many new names as must have given him great occasion to marvel at the resources of the English language, as must have given him great occasion to marvel at the resources of the English language, submitted to have his cravat put on, and being dressed, and finding himself in a brisk flow of spirits, after this exercise went downstairs to enliven Dombey, and his right-hand man Dombey was not yet in the room, but the right-hand man was there, and his dental treasures were as usual ready for the major. "Well, sir," said the major, "how have you passed the time since I had the happiness of meeting you? Have you walked at all?" And his right-hand man Dombey was not yet in the room, but the right-hand man was there, and his dental treasures were as usual ready for the major. "Well, sir," said the major, "how have you passed the time since I had the happiness of meeting you? Have you walked at all?" "A saunter of barely half an hour's duration," returned Cocker. "We have been." "Half an hour's duration," returned Cocker. "We have been so much occupied business, said the major. "A variety of little matters necessary to be gone through," replied Cocker. "But do you know this is quite unusual with me, educated in a distrustful school, and who am not generally disposed to be communicative," he said, breaking off and speaking in a charming tone of frankness. "But I feel quite confidential wary to be gone through," replied Cocker. "But do you know this is quite unusual with me, educated in a distrustful school, and who am not generally disposed to be communicative," he said, breaking off and speaking in a charming tone of frankness. "But I feel quite confidential with you, Major Bagstock." "You do me honor, sir," returned the major. "You may be. Do you know then," pursued Cocker, "that I have not found my friend R. Stock." "You do me honor, sir," returned the major. "You may be. Do you know then," pursued Cocker, "that I have not found my friend R. Friend I ought rather to call him, meaning don't be, sir," cried the major. "You see me, Mr. Parker, standing here, JB. He was puffy enough to see, and blue enough, and Mr. Cargo intimated that he had that pleasure. Then you see a man, sir, who would go through fire and water to serve Dobby," returned Major Bagstock. Mr. Cargo smiled and said he was sure of it. "Do you know, Major, he was puffy enough to see, and blue enough, and Mr. Cargo intimated that he had that pleasure. Then you see a man, sir, who would go through fire and water to serve Dobby," returned Major Bagstock. Mr. Cargo smiled and said he was sure of it. "Do you know, Major," he proceeded to resume, "where I left off, that I have not found our friend so attentive to business today as usual. Where I left off, that I have not found our friend so attentive to business today as usual. Observed the delighted major. "I have found him a little abstracted, and with his attention disposed to wander," said Cocker. "By Jove, sir," cried the major, "there's a lady in the case." "Indeed, I begin to believe there really is," returned Cocker. "I thought you might be jesting when you seemed to hint at it, for I know you military men." The major gave the horse's cough and shook his head and shoulders, as much as to say, "Well, we are gay dogs, there's no denying." He then seized Mr. Parker by the turned Cocker. "I thought you might be jesting when you seemed to hint at it, for I know you military men." The major gave the horse's cough and shook his head and shoulders, as much as to say, "Well, we are gay dogs, there's no denying." He then seized Mr. Parker by the buttonhole and with starting eyes whispered in his ear that she was a woman of extraordinary charm, sir, that she was a young widow, sir, that she was of a fine family, sir, that Dombey was over head and ears in love with her, sir, and that it would be a good match on both sides, for she had beauty, blood, and talent, that she was a woman of extraordinary charm, sir, that she was a young widow, sir, that she was of a fine family, sir, that Dombey was over head and ears in love with her, sir, and that it would be a good match on both sides, for she had beauty, blood, and talent, and Dombey had fortune. And what more could any couple have? Hearing Mr. Dombey's footsteps, without the major cut himself short by saying that Mr. Cargar would see her tomorrow. Fortune. And what more could any couple have? Hearing Mr. Dombey's footsteps, without the major cut himself short by saying that Mr. Cargar would see her tomorrow morning and would judge for himself, and between his mental excitement and the exertion of saying all this in wheezy whispers, the major sat gurgling in the throat and watering at the eyes until dinner was ready. The major, like some other noble animals, exhibited himself to great advantage at feeding time. On this occasion he shone resplendent at one end of the table, supported by the milder luster of Mr. Dombey at the other, while Cock on one side lent his ray to either light or suffered. Animals exhibited himself to great advantage at feeding time. On this occasion He shone resplendent at one end of the table, supported by the milder luster of Mr. Dombey at the other, while Kaka on one side lent his ray to either light or suffered it to merge into both as occasion arose during the first course or two. The major was usually grave for the native, and obedience to general orders secretly issued collected every sauce and crew it round him and gave him a great deal to do in taking out the stoppers and mixing up the contents in his plate. First course or two, the major was usually grave for the native, and obedience to general orders secretly issued collected every sauce and crew it round him and gave him a great deal to do in taking out the stoppers and mixing up the contents in his plate, besides which the native had private zests and flavors on a side table, with which the major daily scorched himself, to say nothing of strange machines, out of which he spirited unknown. The native had private zests and flavors on a side table, with which the major daily scorched himself, to say nothing of strange machines, out of which he spirited unknown liquids into the major's drinks. But on this occasion Major Bagstock, even amidst these many occupations, found time to be social, and his sociality consisted in excessive slyness for the behoof of Mr. Carker and the betrayal of Mr. Dombey's state of mind. Tommy, said the major, "You don't eat? What's the matter?" "Thank you," returned that's these many occupations found time to be social, and his sociality consisted in excessive slyness for the behoof of Mr. Carker and the betrayal of Mr. Dombey's state of mind. Tommy, said the major, "You don't eat? What's the matter?" "Thank you," returned the gentleman, "I'm doing very well. I have no great appetite today." "Why, Dombey, what's become of it?" asked the major. "Where's it gone? You haven't left it with our—" "Very well, I have no great appetite today." "Why, Dombey, what's become of it?" asked the major. "Where's it gone? You haven't left it with our friends." "I'll swear, for I can answer for their having none today at luncheon. I can answer for one of them, at least. I won't say which." Then the major winked at Carker and became so frightfully sly that his dark attendant was obliged to pat him on the back without orders, or he would probably have disappeared under the table in a later stage of the dinner, that is to say, when the native stood at the major's elbow ready to serve the, and became so frightfully sly that his dark attendant was obliged to pat him on the back without orders, or he would probably have disappeared under the table in a later stage of the dinner, that is to say, when the native stood at the major's elbow ready to serve the first bottle of champagne. The major became still slyer. "Fill champagne." The major became still slyer. "Fill this to the brim, you scoundrel," said the major, holding up his glass. "Fill Mr. Cocker's to the brim too, and Mr. Dombey's to, by gad, gentlemen," said the major, winking at his new friend, while Mr. Dombey looked into his plate with a conscious air. "Well, consecrate this glass of wine to a divinity whom Joe is proud to know, and at a dish to the brim too, and Mr. Dombey's to, by gad, gentlemen," said the major, winking at his new friend, while Mr. Dombey looked into his plate with a conscious air. "Well, consecrate this glass of wine to a divinity whom Joe is proud to know, and at a distance humbly and reverently to admire." "Edith," said the major. "Is her name Angelic?" "Edith, to Angelic Edith," cried the smiling Carker. "Edith, by all means," said Mr. "Reverently to admire Edith," said the major. "Is her name Angelic?" "Edith, to Angelic Edith," cried the smiling Carker. "Edith, by all means," said Mr. Dombey. The entrance of the waiters with new dishes caused the major to be slyer yet, but in a more serious vein. "For though among ourselves Joe Bagstock mingles jest and earnest on this subject, sir," said the major, laying his finger on his lips, and spake. The entrance of the waiters with new dishes caused the major to be slyer yet, but in a more serious vein. "For though among ourselves Joe Bagstock mingles jest and earnest on this subject, sir," said the major, laying his finger on his lips, and speaking half apart to Cocker, "he holds that name to sacred, to be made the property of these fellows, or of any fellows, not a word, sir, while they are here." This was respectful and becoming on the major's part, and Mr. Dombey plainly felt it so. To Cocker, "He holds that name to sacred, to be made the property of these fellows, or of any fellows, not a word, sir, while they are here." This was respectful and becoming on the major's part, and Mr. Dombey plainly felt it so. Although embarrassed in his own frigid way by the major's allusions, Mr. Dombey had no objection to such rallying, it was clear, but rather courted it. Perhaps the major had been pretty near the truth when he had divined that morning that the great man who was too haughty formerly to consult with or confide in his prime minister on such a matter, yet wished him to be fully possessed of it. Let this be how it may, he often glanced at Mr. Park. Major had been pretty near the truth when he had divined that morning that the great man who was too haughty formerly to consult with or confide in his prime minister on such a matter, yet wished him to be fully possessed of it. Let this be how it may, he often glanced at Mr. Parker while the major plied his light artillery, and seemed watchful of its effect upon him. But the major, having secured an attentive listener and a smiler who had not his match in all the world, and forced a devilish intelligent and able fellow, as he often afterwards declared, was not going to let him off with a little slyness personal to Mr. Don. But the major, having secured an attentive listener and a smiler who had not his match in all the world, and forced a devilish intelligent and able fellow, as he often afterwards declared, was not going to let him off with a little slyness personal to Mr. Dombey. Therefore, on the removal of the cloth, the major developed himself as a choice spirit in the broader and more comprehensive range of narrating regimental stories and cracking regimental jokes, which, removal of the cloth, the major developed himself as a choice spirit in the broader and more comprehensive range of narrating regimental stories and cracking regimental jokes, which he did with such prodigal exuberance that Carker was ordained to be quite exhausted with laughter and admiration, while Mr. Dombey looked down over his starched cravat like the major's proprietor, or like a stately showman who was glad to see his bear dancing well when the prodigal exuberance that Carker was ordained to be quite exhausted with laughter and admiration, while Mr. Dombey looked down over his starched cravat like the major's proprietor, or like a stately showman who was glad to see his bear dancing well when the major was to horse with meat and drink, and the display of his social powers to render himself intelligible any longer, they adjourned to coffee, after which the major inquired of Mr. Carr, the manager, with meat and drink, and the display of his social powers to render himself intelligible any longer, they adjourned to coffee, after which the major inquired of Mr. Carr, the manager, with little apparent hope of an answer in the affirmative, if he played piquet. Yes, I play piquet a little, said Mr. Cocker. Backgammon, perhaps, observed the major, hesitating. Yes, I play backgammon a little, to replied the man of teeth. Cargrave plays at all games, I believe, said Mr. Dombey, laying himself on a sofa like a man of wood, without a hinge or joint in him, and plays them well. In sooth, he played the two in question to such perfection that the major was astonished, and asked him at random if Mr. Dombey, laying himself on a sofa like a man of wood, without a hinge or joint in him, and plays them well. In sooth, he played the two in question to such perfection that the major was astonished, and asked him at random if he played chess. Yes, I play chess a little, answered Carker. I have sometimes played and won a game. It's a mere trick without seeing the board. By gad, sir, said the major, staring, you are a contrast to John Bear, who plays nothing. Oh, he returned. The manager, he has never had occasion. As a little, answered Carker. I have sometimes played and won a game. It's a mere trick without seeing the board. By gad, sir, said the major, staring, you are a contrast to John Bear, who plays nothing. Oh, he returned. The manager, he has never had occasion to acquire such little arts to men like me. They are sometimes useful, as at present, Major Bagstock, when they enable me to take a hand with you. It might be only the false mouth, so smooth and wide, and yet they're such little arts to men like me. They are sometimes useful, as at present, Major Bagstock, when they enable me to take a hand with you. It might be only the false mouth, so smooth and wide, and yet there seemed to lurk beneath the humility and subservience of this short speech a snarl, and for a moment one might have thought that the white teeth were prone to bite the hand they fondled on. But the major thought nothing about it, and Mr. Dombey lay meditating with his eyes half shut during the whole of the play, which lasted until bedtime. By that time, Mr. Cocker, though the winner, had mounted high into the major's good opinion, insomuch that when he left the major at his own room, with his eyes half shut during the whole of the play, which lasted until bedtime. By that time, Mr. Cocker, though the winner, had mounted high into the major's good opinion, insomuch that when he left the major at his own room, before going to bed, the major, as a special attention, sent the native, who always rested on a mattress spread upon the ground at his master's door along the gallery, to light him to his room in state. There was a faint blur on the surface of the mirror in Mr. Parker's chamber, and its reflection was perhaps a false one, but it showed that night the image of a man who saw in his fancy a crowd of people slumbering on the ground at his feet, like the poor native at his master's door, who mirror in Mr. Parker's chamber, and its reflection was perhaps a false one, but it showed that night the image of a man who saw in his fancy a crowd of people slumbering on the ground at his feet like the poor native at his master's door, who picked his way among them, looking down maliciously enough, but trod upon no upturned face. Chapter 27. Deeper shadows. Mr. Carker, the manager, rose with a lark and went out walking in the summer day his meditations, and he meditated with contracted brows while he strolled along. Hardly seemed to soar as high as the lark or to mount in that direction. Rather they kept close to their nest upon the earth, and looked about among the dust and worms. In the summer day his meditations, and he meditated with contracted brows while he strolled along. Hardly seemed to soar as high as the lark or to mount in that direction. Rather they kept close to their nest upon the earth, and looked about among the dust and worms. But there was not a bird in the air singing, a bird in the air singing, unseen farther beyond the reach of human eye than Mr. Parker's thoughts. He had his face so perfectly under control that few could say more in distinct terms of its expression than that it smiled, or that it pondered. It pondered now intently. As the lark rose higher, he sank deeper in thought. As the lark poured out her melody clearer and stronger, he fell into a graver and profounder silence. At length, when the lark's of its expression than that it smiled, or that it pondered now intently. As the lark rose higher, he sank deeper in thought. As the lark poured out her melody clearer and stronger, he fell into a graver and profounder silence. At length, when the lark came headlong down with an accumulating stream of song and dropped among the green wheat near him, rippling in the breath of the morning like a river, he sprang up from his reverie and looked round with a sudden smile as courteous and as soft as if he had had numerous observers to prepossess. Nor did he relapse after being thus awakened, but clearing his face like one who bethought himself that it might otherwise wrinkle, and telltales went smiling on, as if for Betrayal, as courteous and as soft as if he had had numerous observers to prepossess. Nor did he relapse after being thus awakened, but clearing his face like one who bethought himself that it might otherwise wrinkle, and telltales went smiling on, as if for practice, perhaps with an eye to first impressions. Mr. Parker was very carefully and trimly dressed. With an eye to first impressions, Mr. Parker was very carefully and trimly dressed. That morning, though always somewhat formal in his dress in imitation of the great man whom he served, he stopped short of the extent of Mr. Dombey's stiffness at once, perhaps because he knew it to be ludicrous, and because in doing so he found another means of expressing his sense of the difference and distance between them. Some people quoted him indeed in this respect as a pointed commentary, perhaps because he knew it to be ludicrous, and because in doing so he found another means of expressing his sense of the difference and distance between them. Some people quoted him indeed in this respect as a pointed commentary, and not a flattering one, on his icy patron. But the world is prone to misconstruction, and Mr. Parker was not accountable for its bad propensity, clean and florid, with his light complexion fading, as it were, in the sun, and his dainty step enhancing the softness of the turf. Mr. Parker, the manager, strolled about meadows and green lanes, and glided among avenues of trees, until it was time to return to breakfast. Taking a nearer way back, Mr. Carker pursued it, airing his teeth, enhancing the softness of the turf. Mr. Parker, the manager, strolled about meadows and green lanes, and glided among avenues of trees, until it was time to return to breakfast. Taking a nearer way back, Mr. Carker pursued it, airing his teeth, and said aloud as he did so, now to see the second Mrs. Dombey. He had strolled beyond the town and entered it by a pleasant walk where there was a deep shade of leafy trees, and where there were a few benches here and there for those who chose to rest, it not being a place of general resort at any hour, and wearing at that time of the still morning a air of being quite deserted and retired. Mr. Carr had it, or thought he had it, all to himself, so with the whim of an idle man to whom there yet remained 20 minutes for reaching a destination easily accessible in 10 minutes, wearing at that time of the still morning a air of being quite deserted and retired. Mr. Carr had it, or thought he had it, all to himself, so with the whim of an idle man to whom there yet remained 20 minutes for reaching a destination easily accessible in 10 minutes, Mr. Parker threaded the great boles of the trees, and went passing in and out before this one and behind that, weaving a chain of footsteps on the dewy ground. But he found he was mistaken in supposing there was no one in the grove, for as he softly rounded the trunk of one large tree on with great boles of the trees, and went passing in and out before this one, and behind that weaving a chain of footsteps on the dewy ground. But he found he was mistaken in supposing there was no one in the grove, for as he softly rounded the trunk of one large tree on which the obdurate bark was knotted and overlapped like the hide of a rhinoceros or some kindred monster of the ancient days before the flood, he saw an unexpected figure sitting on a bench near at hand, about which in another was knotted and overlapped like the hide of a rhinoceros or some kindred monster of the ancient days before the flood. He saw an unexpected figure sitting on a bench near at hand, about which in another moment he would have wound the chain he was making. It was that of a lady elegantly dressed and very handsome, whose dark proud eyes were fixed upon the ground, and in whom some passion or struggle was raging, for as she sat looking down she held a corner of her under lip within her mouth. Her bosom heaved, her nostril quivered, her head trembled, indignant tears were and very handsome, whose dark proud eyes were fixed upon the ground, and in whom some passion or struggle was raging, for as she sat looking down she held a corner of her under lip within her mouth. Her bosom heaved, her nostril quivered, her head trembled, indignant tears were on her cheek, and her foot was set upon the moss, as though she would have crushed it into nothing, and yet almost the self same. And her foot was set upon the moss, as though she would have crushed it into nothing, and yet almost the self same. Glance that showed him the self same lady rising with a scornful air of weariness and lassitude, and turning away with nothing expressed in face or figure, but careless beauty and imperious disdain, a withered and very ugly old woman, dressed not so much like a gypsy as like any of that medley race of vagabonds who tramp about the country begging and stealing and tinkering and weaving rushes, but careless beauty and imperious disdain, a withered and very ugly old woman, dressed not so much like a gypsy as like any of that medley race of vagabonds who tramp about the country begging and stealing and tinkering and weaving rushes by turns, all altogether had been observing the lady too, for as she rose this second figure strangely confronting the first scrambled up from the ground. Out of it almost appeared and stood in the way. "Let me tell your fortune, my pretty lady," said the old woman, munching with her jaws as if the deaths had beneath her yellow skin were impatient to get out. "I can tell it for myself," was the reply. "I, pretty lady, but not right. You didn't tell it right when you were sitting there. I see you give me a piece of silver, pretty lady, and I'll tell your fortune true. There's riches, pretty lady, in your face, I know," returned the lady, passing with a dark smile and a proud step. "I knew it before. What, you won't give me nothing?" cried the old woman. "You won't give me nothing to tell your fortune, pretty lady? How much will you give me not to tell it? Then give me something, or I'll call it after you," croaked the old woman, the lady passing with a dark smile and a proud step. "I knew it before. What, you won't give me nothing?" cried the old woman. "You won't give me nothing to tell your fortune, pretty lady? How much will you give me not to tell it? Then give me something, or I'll call it after you," croaked the old woman passionately. Mr. Parker, whom the lady was about to pass close, slinking against his tree as she crossed again the path, advanced so as to meet Mr. Parker, whom the lady was about to pass close, slinking against his tree as she crossed again the path, advanced so as to meet her, and pulling off his hat as she went by, bade the old woman hold her peace. The lady acknowledged his interference with an inclination of the head and went her way. "You give me something then, or I'll call it after her," screamed the old woman, throwing up her arms and pressing forward against his outstretched hand. "Or come," she added, dropping her voice suddenly, looking at him earnestly and seeming in a moment to forget the object of her wrath. "Call it after her," screamed the old woman, throwing up her arms and pressing forward against his outstretched hand. "Or come," she added, dropping her voice suddenly, looking at him earnestly and seeming in a moment to forget the object of her wrath. "Give me something, or I'll call it after you." "After me, old lady," returned the manager, putting his hand in his pocket. "Yes," said the woman, steadfast in her scrutiny and holding out her shriveled hand. "I know." "What do you know?" demanded Cocker, throwing her a shilling. "Do you know who the handsome lady is munching like that sailor's wife of yours, who had chestnuts in her lap and scowling like the witch who asked for some in vain?" The old woman picked the shilling up and going backwards. "No, what do you know?" demanded Cocker, throwing her a shilling. "Do you know who the handsome lady is munching like that sailor's wife of yours, who had chestnuts in her lap and scowling like the witch who asked for some in vain?" The old woman picked the shilling up and going backwards like a crab or like a heap of crabs for her alternately, or like a heap of crabs for her alternately. Expanding and contracting hands might have represented two of that species, and her creeping face some half a dozen more crouch on the Venus root of an old tree, pulled out a short black pipe from within the crown of her bonnet, lighted it with a match and smoked in silence. Looking fixedly at her questioner, Mr. Parker laughed and turned upon, and her creeping face some half a dozen more crouch on the Venus root of an old tree, pulled out a short black pipe from within the crown of her bonnet, lighted it with a match and smoked in silence. Looking fixedly at her questioner, Mr. Parker laughed and turned upon his heel. Good, said the old woman. One child dead, and one child living, one wife dead, and one wife come and go and meet her in spite of himself. The old woman. One child dead, and one child living, one wife dead, and one wife come and go and meet her in spite of himself. The manager looked round again and stopped the old woman, who had not removed her pipe and was munching and mumbling while she smoked as if in conversation with an invisible familiar, pointed with her finger in the direction he was going, and laughed. What was that you said, Bedlamite? He demanded. The woman mumbled and chattered and smoked and still pointed before him, but remained silent, muttering a farewell that was not complimentary. Mr. Parker pursued his way, but as he turned out of it, he was going, and laughed. What was that you said, Bedlamite? He demanded. The woman mumbled and chattered and smoked and still pointed before him, but remained silent, muttering a farewell that was not complimentary. Mr. Parker pursued his way, but as he turned out of that place and looked over his shoulder at the root of the old tree, he could yet see the finger pointing before him, and thought he heard the woman screaming, "Go and meet her." Preparations for a choice repast were completed. He found at the hotel, and Mr. Dombey and the Major and the breakfast were awaiting. The lady's individual constitution has much to do with the development of such facts, no doubt, but in this case appetite carried it hollow over the tender passion. Mr. Dombey being very Mr. Dombey and the Major and the breakfast were awaiting. The lady's individual constitution has much to do with the development of such facts, no doubt, but in this case appetite carried it hollow over the tender passion. Mr. Dombey being very cool and collected, and the Major fretting and fuming in a state of violent heat and irritation. At length the door was thrown open by the native, and after a pause occupied by her languishing along the gallery, a very blooming, but not very youthful lady appeared. "My dearest Dobby," said the lady, "I am afraid we are late, but Edith has been out already looking for a favorable point of view for a sketch, and kept me waiting for her." The lady, "I am afraid we are late, but Edith has been out already looking for a favorable point of view for a sketch, and kept me waiting for her." Falsest of Majors, giving him her little finger. "How do you do, Mrs. Scutton?" said Mr. Dobby. "Let me gratify my friend Carter." Mr. Dombey unconsciously emphasized the word friend, as saying, "No, really, I do allow him to take credit for that distinction by presenting him to you. You have Scutton," said Mr. Dobby. "Let me gratify my friend Carter." Mr. Dombey unconsciously emphasized the word friend, as saying, "No, really, I do allow him to take credit for that distinction by presenting him to you. You have heard me mention Mr. Carker." "I am charmed, I am sure," said Mrs. Scutton graciously. Mr. Carker was charmed, of course. Would he have been more charmed on Mr. Dobby's behalf if Mrs. Scutton had been, as he had first supposed her, the Edith whom they had toasted overnight? "Why, mention Mr. Carker, I am charmed, I am sure," said Mrs. Scutton graciously. Mr. Carker was charmed, of course. Would he have been more charmed on Mr. Dobby's behalf if Mrs. Scutton had been, as he had first supposed her, the Edith whom they had toasted overnight? "Why, where for heaven's sake is Edith?" exclaimed Mrs. Scutton, looking round still at the door, giving Withers orders about the mounting of those Troys. "My dear Mr. Dombey, will you have the kindness—" Mr. Dombey was already gone to seek her next moment. He returned, bearing on his arm the same elegantly dressed and very handsome lady whom Mr. Parker had encountered underneath the trees. "Cocker," began Mr. Dombey, but their recognition of each other was so manifest that Mr. Dombey stopped. "Surprised I am obliged to the gentleman," said Edith with a stately bend, "for sparing me some annoyance from an importunate beggar. Just now I am obliged to my good fortune," said Mr. Parker, bowing low, "for the opportunity of rendering so slight a service to one whose servant I am proud to be." As her eye rested on him for an instant, and then lighted on the ground, he saw service to one whose servant I am proud to be. As her eye rested on him for an instant, and then lighted on the ground, he saw in its bright and searching glance a suspicion that he had not come up at the moment of his interference, but had secretly, and a suspicion that he had not come up at the moment of his interference, but had secretly observed her sooner, as he saw that she saw in his eye that her distrust was not without foundation. Really, cried Mrs. Scutton, who had taken this opportunity of inspecting Mr. Cocker through her glass and satisfying herself as she lisped audibly to the Major that he was all heart. Really, now this is one of the most enchanting. Not without foundation. Really, cried Mrs. Scutton, who had taken this opportunity of inspecting Mr. Cocker through her glass and satisfying herself as she lisped audibly to the Major that he was all heart. Really, now this is one of the most enchanting coincidences that I ever heard of. The idea, my dearest Edith, there is such an obvious destiny in it that really one might almost be induced to cross one's arms upon one's frock and say, like those wicked Turks, there is no what's his name but thingamy, and what you may call it is his prophet. Edith designed but thingamy, and what you may call it is his prophet. Edith designed no revision of this extraordinary quotation from the Quran, but Mr. Dobby felt it necessary to offer a few polite remarks. It gives me great pleasure, said Mr. Dombey with cumbrous gallantry, that a gentleman so nearly connected with myself as Carter is should have had the honor, that a gentleman so nearly connected with myself as Carter is should have had the honor and happiness of rendering the least assistance to Mrs. Granger. Mr. Dombey bowed to her. But it gives me some pain, and it occasions me to be really envious of pain, and it occasions me to be really envious of Cocker. He unconsciously laid stress on these words, as sensible that they must appear to involve a very surprising proposition. Envious of Carca, that I had not that honor and that happiness myself. Mr. Dombey bowed again. Edith, saving for a curl of her lip, was motionless, and that happiness myself. Mr. Dombey bowed again. Edith, saving for a curl of her lip, was motionless. By the Lord, sir, cried the Major, bursting into speech at sight of the waiter who was come to announce breakfast. It's an extraordinary thing to me that no one can have the honor and happiness of shooting all such beggars through the head without being brought to book for it. But here's an arm for Mrs. Granger, if she do JB the honor to accept it, and the greatest service Joe can render you, ma'am, just now is to lead you into table with this. The Major gave his arm to Edith. Mr. Dobby led the way. With Mrs. Scutton, Mr. Carco went last, smiling on the party. I'm quite rejoiced, Mr. Carker, said the Lady Mother at breakfast, after another approving survey of him through her glass, that you have timed your visit so happily as to go with us today. It is the most enchanting expedition. Any expedition would be enchanting. Through her glass, that you have timed your visit so happily as to go with us today. It is the most enchanting expedition. Any expedition would be enchanting in such society, returned Cargor. But I believe it is in itself full of interest, cried Mrs. Scutchen, with a faded little scream of rapture. The castle is charming associations of the Middle Ages, and all that which is so truly exquisite, don't you doubt upon the middle. Self full of interest, cried Mrs. Scutchen, with a faded little scream of rapture. The castle is charming associations of the Middle Ages, and all that which is so truly exquisite, don't you doubt upon the middle ages. Mr. Carker, very much indeed, said Mr. Parker. Such charming times, cried Cleopatra, so full of faith, so vigorous and forcible, so picturesque, so perfectly removed from common. Much indeed, said Mr. Parker. Such charming times, cried Cleopatra, so full of faith, so vigorous and forcible, so picturesque, so perfectly removed from commonplace. Oh dear, if they would only leave us a little more of the poetry of existence in these terrible days. Mrs. Scutton was looking sharp after Mr. Dombey all the time she said this, who was looking at Edith, who was listening, but who never lifted up her eyes. We are dreadfully real, Mr. Cuttance, in these terrible days. Mrs. Scutton was looking sharp after Mr. Dombey all the time she said this, who was looking at Edith, who was listening, but who never lifted up her eyes. We are dreadfully real, Mr. Cocker, said Mrs. Scutton. Are we not? Few people had less reason to complain of their reality than Cleopatra, who had as much that was false about her as could well go to the composition of anybody with a real individual existence. But Mr. Parker commiserated our reality nevertheless, and agreed that we were very hardly used in that regard. Pictures at the castle, quite divine, said Cleopatra. I hope you dote upon pictures. I assure you, Mrs. Scutton, said Mr. Dombey, with solemn encouragement of his manager, that Cocker has a very good taste for pictures, quite a natural power of appreciating them. He is a very creditable artist himself. He will be delighted, I am sure, with Mrs. Grange's taste and skill. Damn it, sir, cried Major Bagstock. My opinion is that you're the admirable Cocker, and can do anything. Smiled Cocker with humility. You are much too sanguine, Major Bagstock. I can do very little, but Mr. Dambley is so generous in his estimation of any trivial accomplishment a man like myself may find it almost necessary to acquire, and to which in his very different sphere he is far superior. That Mr. Cocker shrugged his shoulders, deprecating further praise, and said no more. All this time Edith never raised her eyes unless to glance towards her mother when that lady's fervent spirit shone forth in words. But as Carcass ceased, she looked at Mr. Dobby for a moment only, but with a transient gleam of scornful wonder on her face, not lost on one observer who was smiling round the board. Mr. Dombey caught the dark eyelash in its descent, and took the opportunity of arresting it. You have been to Warwick often, unfortunately, said Mr. Dombey several times. The visit will be tedious to you, I am afraid. Oh no, not at all. Ah, you are like your cousin Phoenix, my dearest Edith, said Mrs. Scutton. He has been to Warwick Castle 50 times, if he has been there once yet. If he came to Leamington tomorrow, I wish he would, dear angel, he would make his 52nd visit. Next day. We are all enthusiastic, are we not, Mamma, said Edith with a cold smile. Too much so for our peace, perhaps, my dear, returned her mother, but we won't complain. Our own emotions are our recompense. If, as your cousin Phoenix says, the sword wears out the what's-its-name, the scabbard, perhaps, said Edith. Exactly, a little too fast it is, because it is bright and glowing, you know, my dearest love. Mrs. Scutton heaved a gentle sigh, supposed to cast a shadow on the surface of that dagger of laugh whereof her susceptible bosom was the sheath, and leaning her head on one side in the Cleopatra manner, looked with pensive affection on her darling child. Edith had turned her face towards Mr. Dobby when he first addressed her, and had remained in that attitude while speaking to her mother, and while her mother spoke to her as though offering him her attention. If he had anything more to say, there was something in the manner of this simple courtesy almost defiant, and giving it the character of being rendered on compulsion, or as a matter of traffic, to which she was a reluctant party. Again, not lost upon that same observer who was smiling round the board. It set him thinking of her as he had first seen her, when she had believed herself to be alone among the trees. M.R. Dombey, having nothing else to say, proposed, the breakfast now being finished, and the Major gorged like any Borkenstruder, that they should start a barouche being in waiting according to the orders of that gentleman. The two ladies, the Major and himself, took their seats in at the Native, and the one page mounted the box, Mr. Tallinson being left behind, and Mr. Carker on horseback brought up the rear. Mr. Carker canted behind the carriage at the distance of 100 yards or so, and watched it during all the ride as if he were a cat indeed, and its for occupants mice, whether he looked to one side of the road or to the other over distant landscape, with its smooth undulations, windmills, corn, grass, bean fields, wild flowers, farmyards, hayricks, and the spire among the wood, or upwards in the sunny air where butterflies were sporting round his head and birds were pouring out their songs, or downward where the shadows of the branches interlaced and made a trembling carpet on the road, or onward where the overhanging trees formed aisles and arches dimmed with the softened light that steeped through leaves. One corner of his eye was ever on the formal head of Mr. Dobby, addressed towards him, and the feather in the bonnet drooping so neglectfully and scornfully between them, much as he had seen the haughty eyelids droop. Not least so when the face met that now fronting it once, and once only did his wary glance release these objects, and that was when a leap over a low hedge and a gallop across a field enabled him to anticipate the carriage coming by the road, and to be standing ready at the journey's end to hand the ladies out then. But then he met her glance for an instant in her first surprise, but when he touched her in alighting with his soft white hand, it overlooked him altogether. As before, Mrs. Scutton was bent on taking charge of Mr. Carker herself, and showing him the beauties of the castle. She was determined to have his arm, and the Major's too. It would do that incorrigible creature, who was the most barbarous infidel in point of poetry, good to be in such company. This chance arrangement left Mr. Dombey at liberty to escort Edith, which he did, stalking before them through the apartments with a gentlemanly solemnity. There's darling bygone times, Mr. Carker, said Cleopatra, with their delicious fortresses and their dear old dungeons, and their delightful places of torture, and their romantic vengeances, and their picturesque assaults and sieges, and everything that makes life truly charming. How dreadfully we have degenerated. Yes, we have fallen off deplorably, said Mr. Parker. The peculiarity of their conversation was that Mrs. Scutton, in spite of her ecstasies, and Mr. Crockett, in spite of his urbanity, were both intent on watching Mr. Dombey and Edith with all their conversational endowments. They spoke somewhat distractedly, and at random in consequence. We have no faith left positively, said Mrs. Scutton, advancing her shriveled ear, for Mr. Dombey was saying something to Edith. We have no faith in the dear old barons, who are the most delightful creatures, or in the dear old priests, who are the most warlike of men, or even in the days of that inestimable Queen Bess up on the wall there, which was so extremely gilded. Dear creature, she was all heart, and that charming father of hers. I hope you don't doubt on Harry VIII. I admire him very much, said Cocker. So bluff, cried Mrs. Scutton. Wasn't here so burly, so truly English. Such a picture too he makes with his dear little peepy eyes, and his benevolent chin. Ma'am, said Kara, stopping short. But if you speak of pictures, there's a composition. What gallery in the world can produce the counterpart of that? As the smiling gentleman thus spake, he pointed to a doorway to where Mr. Dombey and Edith were standing alone in the center of another room. They were not interchanging a word or a look, standing together arm in arm. They had the appearance of being more divided than if seas had rolled between them. There was a difference even in the pride of the two that removed them farther from each other than if one had been the proudest and the other the humblest specimen of humanity in all creation. He self-important, unbending, formal, austere, she lovely and graceful in an uncommon degree, but totally regardless of herself and him and everything around, and spurning her own attractions with her haughty brow and lip as if they were a badge or livery. She hated, so unmatched were they, and opposed, so forced and linked together by a chain which adverse hazard and chance had forged, that fancy might have imagined the pictures on the walls around them, startled by the unnatural conjunction, and observant of it in their several expressions. Grim knights and warriors looked scowling on them. A churchman, with his hand upraised, denounced the mockery of such a couple. Coming to God's altar, quiet waters in landscapes, with the sun reflected in their depths, asked if better means of escape were not at hand. Was there no drowning left? Ruins, cried, look here, and see what we are, wedded to uncongenial time. Animals, opposed by nature, worried one another as a moral to them. Loves and cupids took to flight, afraid, and martyrdom had no such torment in its painted history of suffering. Nevertheless, Mrs. Scutton was so charmed by the sight, to which Mr. Carker invoked her detention, that she could not refrain from saying half aloud, how sweet, how very full of soul. It was Edith, overhearing, looking round, and flushed indignant scarlet to her hair. My dearest Edith knows I was admiring her, said Cleopatra, tapping her almost timidly on the back with her parasol. Sweet pet, again. Mr. Carr saw the strife he had witnessed so unexpectedly among the trees again. He saw the haughty languor and indifference come over it and hide it like a cloud. She did not raise her eyes to him, but with a slight peremptory motion of them seemed to bid her mother come near. Mrs. Scutton thought it expedient to understand the hint, and advancing quickly with her to Cavaliers, kept near her daughter from that time. Mr. Carr, now having nothing to distract his attention, began to discourse upon the pictures, and to select the best and point them out to Mr. Dombey, speaking with his usual familiar recognition of Mr. Dombey's greatness, and rendering homage by adjusting his eyeglass for him, or finding out the right place in his catalogue, or holding his stick, or the like. These services did not so much originate with Mr. Carcar in truth as with Mr. Dombey himself, who was apt to assert his chieftainship by saying with subdued authority, and in an easy way for him, here, Carcar, have the goodness to assist me, will you? Which the smiling gentleman always did with pleasure. They made the tour of the pictures, the walls, crow's nest, and so forth, and as they were still one little party, and the Major was rather in the shade, being sleepy during the process of digestion, Mr. Parker became communicative and agreeable. At first he addressed himself for the most part to Mrs. Scutton, but as that sensitive lady was in such ecstasies with the works of art after the first quarter of an hour that she could do nothing but yawn. They were such perfect inspirations, she observed. As a reason for that mark of rapture, he transferred his attentions to Mr. Dombey. Mr. Dombey said little beyond an occasional very true Cocker, or indeed Cocker, but he tacitly encouraged Carr to proceed and inwardly approved of his behavior, very much deeming it as well that somebody should talk, and thinking that his remarks, which were, as one might say, a branch of the parent establishment, might amuse Mrs. Granger. Mr. Carr, who possessed an excellent discretion, never took the liberty of addressing that lady direct, but she seemed to listen, though she never looked at him, and once or twice, when he was emphatic in his peculiar humility, the twilight smile stole over her face, not as a light, but as a deep black shadow. Warwick Castle being at length pretty well exhausted, and the Major very much so too. Say nothing of Mrs. Scutton, whose peculiar demonstrations of delight had become very frequent. Indeed, the carriage was again put in requisition, and they rode to several admired points of view in the neighborhood. Mr. Dobbs ceremoniously observed of one of these that a sketch, however slight, from the fair hand of Mrs. Granger would be a remembrance to him of that agreeable day. Though he wanted no artificial remembrance, he was sure here Mr. Dobbs made another of his bows, which he must always highly value. Withers the Lean, having Edith's sketchbook under his arm, was immediately called upon by Mrs. Scutton to produce the same, and the carriage stopped that Edith might take the drawing which Mr. Dobby was to put away among his treasures. "But I am afraid I trouble you too much," said Mr. Dobby. "By no means. Where would you wish it taken from?" she answered, turning to him with the same enforced attention as before. Mr. Dombey, with another bow which cracked the starch in his cravat, would beg to leave that to the artist. "I would rather you chose for yourself," said Edith. "Suppose then," said Mr. Dobby, "we say from here it appears a good spot for the purpose, or Cocker, what do you think?" There happened to be in the foreground, at some little distance, a grove of trees not unlike that in which Mr. Parker had made his chain of footsteps in the morning, and with a seat under one tree greatly resembling in the general character of its situation the point where his chain had broken. "Might I venture to suggest to Mrs. Granger," said Cocker, that is an interesting, almost a curious point of view." She followed the direction of his riding whip with her eyes and raised them quickly to his face. It was the second glance they had exchanged since their introduction, and would have been exactly like the first, but that its expression was plainer. "Will you like that?" said Edith to Mr. Dombey. "I shall be charmed," said Mr. Dombey to Edith. Therefore the carriage was driven to the spot where Mr. Dombey was to be charmed, and Edith, without moving from her seat and opening her sketchbook with her usual proud indifference, began to sketch. "My pencils are all pointless," she said, stopping and turning them over. "Pray allow me," said Mr. Dombey, "or Cocker will do it better, as he understands these things. Cocker, have the goodness to see to these pencils for Mrs. Granger." Mr. Cocker rode up close to the cottage door on Mrs. Granger's side, and letting the rein fall on his horse's neck, took the pencils from her hand with a smile and a bow, and sat in the saddle leisurely mending them. Having done so, he begged to be allowed to hold them and to hand them to her as they were required, and thus Mr. Carr, with many commendations of Mrs. Granger's extraordinary skill, especially in trees, remained closer at her side, looking over the drawing as she made it. Mr. Dombey, in the meantime, stood bolt upright in the carriage like a highly respectable ghost looking on to while Cleopatra and the Major dawdled as to ancient duffs might do. "Are you satisfied with that, or shall I finish it a little more?" said Edith, showing the sketch to Mr. Dombey. Mr. Dombey begged that it might not be touched. "It was perfection. It is most extraordinary," said Cocker, bringing every one of his red gums to bear upon his praise. "I was not prepared for anything so beautiful and so unusual altogether. This might have applied to the sketcher no less than the sketch, but Mr. Parker's manner was openness itself, not as to his mouth alone, but as to his whole spirit. So it continued to be while the drawing was laid aside for Mr. Dombey, and while the sketching materials were put up. Then he handed in the pencils, which were received with a distant acknowledgement of his help, but without a look, and tightening his rein fell back and followed the carriage again, thinking perhaps as he wrote that even this trivial sketch had been made and delivered to its owner as if it had been bargained for and bought, thinking perhaps that, although she had assented with such perfect readiness to his request, her haughty face bent over the drawing or glancing at the distant objects represented in it had been the face of a proud woman engaged in a sordid and miserable transaction, thinking perhaps of such things, but smiling certainly, and Wiley seemed to look about him freely in enjoyment of the air and exercise, keeping always that sharp, corner of his eye upon the carriage, a stroll among the haunted ruins of Kenilworth, and more rides to more points of view, most of which Mrs. Stewart reminded Mr. Dombey Edith had already sketched, as he had seen in looking over her drawings, brought the day's expedition to a close. Mrs. Scutton and Edith were driven to their own lodgings. Mr. Carker was graciously invited by Cleopatra to return thither with Mr. Dombey and the Major in the evening to hear some of Edith's music, and the three gentlemen repaired to their hotel to dinner. The dinner was the counterpart of yesterday's, except that the Major was 24 hours more triumphant and less mysterious. Edith was toasted again. Mr. Dombey was again agreeably embarrassed, and Mr. Carker was full of interest and praise. There were no other visitors at Mrs. Scutton's. Edith's drawings were strewn about the room, a little more abundantly than usual perhaps, and Withers the one page handed round a little stronger tea. The harp was there, the piano was there, and Edith sang and played, but even the music was played by Edith to Mr. Dombey's order, as it were in the same uncompromising way as thus. "Edith, my dearest love," said Mrs. Scutton half an hour after tea, "Mr. Dombey is dying to hear you. I know Mr. Dombey has life enough left to say so for himself, Mamma. I have no doubt I shall be immensely obliged," said Mr. Dombey. "What do you wish?" Piano hesitated. "Mr. Dombey, whatever you please. You have only to choose." Accordingly she began with the piano. It was the same with the harp, the same with her singing, the same with the selection of the pieces that she sang and played, such frigid and constrained yet prompt and pointed acquiescence with the wishes he imposed upon her and on no one else was sufficiently remarkable to penetrate through all the mysteries of piquet and impress itself on Mr. Parker's keen attention. Or did he lose sight of the fact that Mr. Dombey was evidently proud of his power and liked to show it? Nevertheless, Mr. Carker played so well some games with the Major and some with Cleopatra, whose vigilance of eye in respect of Mr. Dombey and Edith no links could have surpassed, that he even heightened his position in the Lady Mother's good graces, and when on taking leave he regretted that he would be obliged to return to London next morning. Cleopatra trusted community of feeling not being met with every day, that it was far from being the last time they would meet. "I hope so," said Mr. Parker, with an expressive look at the couple in the distance as he drew towards the door following the Major. "I think so." Mr. Dombey, who had taken a stately leave of Edith, bent or made some approach to a bend over Cleopatra's couch and said in a low voice, "I have requested Mrs. Grange's permission to call on her tomorrow morning for a purpose, and she has appointed 12 o'clock. May I hope to have the pleasure of finding you at home, madam, afterwards?" Cleopatra was so much fluttered and moved by hearing this of course incomprehensible speech that she could only shut her eyes and shake her head and give Mr. Dombey her hand, which Mr. Dombey, not exactly knowing what to do with, dropped. "Tommy, come along," cried the Major, looking in at the door. "Damn it, Sir, old Joe has a great mind to propose an alteration in the name of the Royal Hotel, and that it should be called the Three Jolly Bachelors in honor of ourselves in Cocker." With this the Major slapped Mr. Dombey on the back and, winking over his shoulder at the ladies, with a frightful tendency of blood to the head, carried him off. Mrs. Scutton reposed on her sofa, and Edith sat apart by her harp in silence, the mother trifling with her fan. Looked stealthily at the daughter more than once, but the daughter, brooding gloomily with downcast eyes, was not to be disturbed. Thus they remained for a long hour without a word, until Mrs. Scutton's maid appeared according to custom to prepare her gradually for night. At night she should have been a skeleton with dart and hourglass rather than a woman. This attendant, for her touch was as the touch of death. The painted object shriveled underneath her hand, the form collapsed, the hair dropped off, the arched dark eyebrows changed to scanty tufts of gray, the pale lips shrunk, the skin became cadaverous and loose. An old worn yellow nodding woman with red eyes alone remained in Cleopatra's place, huddled up like a slovenly bundle in a greasy flannel gown. The very voice was changed as it addressed Edith when they were alone together. "Why don't you tell me," it said sharply, "that he is coming here tomorrow by appointment, because you know it," returned Edith. "Mother," the mocking emphasis she laid on that one word, "you know he has bought me," she resumed, "or that he will tomorrow. He has considered of his bargain. He has shown it to his friend. He is even rather proud of it. He thinks that it will suit him and may be had sufficiently cheap, and he will buy tomorrow. God, that I have lived for this, and that I feel it compress into one handsome face the conscious self-abasement and the burning indignation of 100 women strong in passion and in pride, and there it hit itself with two white shuddering arms. "What do you mean?" returned the angry mother. "Haven't you from a child?" "A child," said Edith, looking at her. "When was I a child? What childhood did you ever leave to me? I was a woman, artful, designing, mercenary, laying snares for men before I knew myself for you, or even understood the base and wretched aim of every new display. I learnt you gave birth to a woman. Look upon her, she is in her pride tonight." As she spoke, she struck her hand upon her beautiful bosom as though she would have beaten down herself. "Look at me," she said, "who have never known what it is to have an honest heart and love. Look at me, taught to scheme and plot when children play, and married in my youth and old age of design to one for whom I had no feeling but indifference. Look at me, whom he left a widow dying before his inheritance descended to him. A judgment on you well deserved. And tell me what has been my life for 10 years since we have been making every effort to endeavor to secure to you a good establishment," rejoined her mother. "That has been your life, and now you have got it. There is no slave in a market, there is no horse in a fair so shown and offered and examined and paraded, mother, as I have been for 10 shameful years," cried Edith with a burning brow, and the same bitter emphasis on the one word. "Is it not so? Have I been made the byword of all kinds of men? Have fools, have profligates, have boys, have dotards dangled after me, and one by one rejected me and fallen off because you were to plain with all your cunning, yes, and to true with all those false pretenses, until we have almost come to be notorious. The license of look and touch," she said with flashing eyes, "have I submitted to it in half the places of resort upon the map of England have I been hawked and vendered here and there until the last grain of self-respect is dead within me, and I loathe myself. Has this been my late childhood? I had none before. Do not tell me that I had tonight. Of all nights in my life, you might have been well married," said her mother 20 times at least. "Edith, if you had given encouragement enough, know who takes me refuse that I am, and as I well deserve to be," she answered, raising her head, and trembling in her energy of shame and stormy pride. "She'll take me, as this man does, with no heart of mine put forth to lure him. He sees me at the auction, and he thinks it well to buy me. Let him. When he came to view me, perhaps to bid, he required to see the roll of my accomplishments. I gave it to him. When he would have me show one of them, to justify his purchase to his men, I required of him to say which he demands, and I exhibited. I will do no more. He makes the purchase of his own will, and with his own sense of its worth and the power of his money, and I hope it may never disappoint him. I have not vaunted and pressed the bargain, neither have you, so far as I have been able to prevent you. You talk strangely tonight, Edith, to your own mother." "It seems so to me, stranger to me than you," said Edith, "but my education was completed long ago. I am too old now, and have fallen to low by degrees, to take a new course, and to stop yours, and to help myself the germ of all that purifies a woman's breast, and makes it true and good, has never stirred in mine, and I have nothing else to sustain me when I despise myself." There had been a touching sadness in her voice, but it was gone when she went on to say with a curled lip, "So as we are Gentile and poor, I am content that we should be made rich by these means. All I say is, I have kept the only purpose I have had the strength to form. I had almost said the power with you at my side, mother, and have not tempted this man on this man." "You speak," said her mother, "as if you hated him, and you thought I loved him, did you not?" she answered, stopping on her way across the room and looking round. "Shall I tell you?" she continued with her eyes fixed on her mother, "who already knows us thoroughly and reads us right, and before whom I have even less of self-respect or confidence than before my own inward self, being so much degraded by his knowledge of me." "This is an attack, I suppose," returned her mother coldly, "on poor unfortunate what's his name, Mr. Carter. Your want of self-respect and confidence, my dear, in reference to that person who is very agreeable, it strikes me, is not likely to have much effect on your establishment. Why do you look at me so hard? Are you?" Edith suddenly let fall her face as if it had been stung, and while she pressed her hands upon it, a terrible tremble crept over her whole frame. It was quickly gone, and with her usual step she passed out of the room. The maid, who should have been a skeleton, then reappeared, and giving one arm to her mistress, who appeared to have taken off her manner with her charms, and to have put on paralysis, with her flannel gown collected the ashes of Cleopatra and carried them away in the other ready for tomorrow's revivification. Chapter 28 Altercations. So the day has come at length, Susan, said Florence to the excellent Nipper, when we are going back to our quiet home. Susan drew in her breath with an amount of expression not easily described, and further relieving her feelings with a smart cough, answered, very quiet indeed, Miss Floy, no doubt excessive. So when I was a child, said Florence thoughtfully, and after musing for some moments, did you ever see that gentleman who has taken the trouble to ride down here to speak to me now 3 times? 3 times. I think, Susan, 3 times, miss, returned the Nipper. Once, when you was out walking with them, Skit. Florence gently looked at her, and Miss Nipper checked herself with Sir Barnard and his lady. I mean to say, miss, and the young gentleman, and to evenings since then, when I was a child, and when company used to come to visit Papa. Did you ever see that gentleman at home? Susan asked Florence. Well, miss, returned her maid after considering, I really couldn't say I ever did when your poor dear ma died, Miss Floy. I was very new in the family, you see, on my element. The Nipper bridled, as if pining that her merits had been always disdainfully extinguished by Mr. Dunby. Was the floor below the attics, to be sure, said Florence, still thoughtfully. You are not likely to have known who came to the house. I quite forgot not, miss. But what we talked about the family and the visitors, said Susan. And but what I heard much said, although the nurse before Mrs. Richards did make unpleasant remarks when I was in company, and hint at little pictures, but that could only be attributed, poor thing, observed Susan with composed forbearance, to habits of intoxication, for which she was required to leave. And did Florence, who was seated at her chamber window, with her face resting on her hand, sat looking out and hardly seemed to hear what Susan said. She was so lost in thought. At all events, miss, said Susan, I remember very well that this same gentleman, Mr. Carke, was almost, if not quite, as great a gentleman with your papa than as he is now. It used to be said in the house then, miss, that he was at the head of all your power's affairs in the city, and managed the whole, and that your power minded him more than anybody, which, begging your pardon, Miss Floy, he might easy do, for he never minded anybody else. I knew that picture, as I might have been. Susan Nipper, with an injured remembrance of the nurse before Mrs. Richards, emphasized picture strongly. And that Mr. Carr has not fallen off, miss, she pursued, but has stood his ground and kept his credit with your pa. I know from what is always said among our people by that perch whenever he comes to the house, and though he's the weakest weed in the world, Miss Floyer, and no one can have a moment's patience with the man, he knows what goes on in the city tolerable well, and says that your part does nothing without Mr. Carr, and leaves all to Mr. Carr, and acts according to Mr. Carr, and has Mr. Carr always at his elbow. And I do believe that he believes that washest of purchase, that after your pa the Emperor of India is the child unborn to Mr. Carr. Not a word of this was lost on Florence, who with an awakened interest in Susan's speech no longer gazed abstractedly on the prospect without, but looked at her and listened with attention. Yes, Susan, she said, when the young lady had concluded, he is in papa's confidence, and is his friend, I am sure. Florence's mind ran high on this theme, and had done for some days. Mr. Carr, in the 2 visits with which he had followed up his first one, had assumed a confidence between himself and her, a right on his part to be mysterious and stealthy in telling her that the ship was still unheard of, a kind of mildly restrained power and authority over her that made her wonder and caused her great uneasiness. She had no means of repelling it or of freeing herself from the web he was gradually winding about her, for that would have required some art and knowledge of the world opposed to such a dress as his. And Florence had none. True, he had said no more to her than that there was no news of the ship, and that he feared the worst, but how he came to know that she was interested in the ship, and why he had the right to signify his knowledge to her so insidiously and darkly, troubled Florence very much. This conduct on the part of Mr. Carker, and her habit of often considering it with wonder and uneasiness, began to invest him with an uncomfortable fascination. In Florence's thoughts, a more distinct remembrance of his features, voice, and manner, which she sometimes courted as a means of reducing him to the level of a real personage capable of exerting no greater charm over her than another, did not remove the vague impression, and yet he never frowned or looked upon her with an air of dislike or animosity, but was always smiling and serene. Again Florence, in pursuit of her strong purpose with reference to her father and her steady resolution to believe that she was herself unwittingly to blame for their so cold and distant relations would recall to mind that this gentleman was his confidential friend, and would think with an anxious heart could her struggling tendency to dislike and fear him be a part of that misfortune in her which had turned her father's love adrift and left her so alone she dreaded that it might be sometimes believed it was then. She resolved that she would try to conquer this wrong feeling, persuaded herself that she was honored and encouraged by the notice of her father's friend, and hoped that patient observation of him and trust in him would lead her bleeding feet along that stony road which ended in her father's heart, this with no one to advise her, for she could advise with no one. Without seeming to complain against him, gentle Florence tossed on an uneasy sea of doubt and hope, and Mr. Carker, like a scaly monster of the deep, swam down below and kept his shining eye upon her. Florence had a new reason in all this for wishing to be at home again. Her lonely life was better suited to her course of timid hope and doubt, and she feared sometimes that in her absence she might miss some hopeful chance of testifying her affection for her father. Heaven knows she might have set her mind at rest, poor child, on this last point. But her slighted love was fluttering within her, and even in her sleep it flew away in dreams and nestled like a wandering bird come home upon her father's neck. Of Walter she thought often, ah, how often, when the night was gloomy and the wind was blowing round the house. But hope was strong in her breast. It is so difficult for the young and ardent, even with such experience as hers, to imagine youth and ardor quenched like a weak flame, and the bright day of life merging into night at noon, that hope was strong, yet her tears fell frequently for Walter's sufferings, but rarely for his supposed death, and never long. She had written to the old instrument maker, but had received no answer to her note, which indeed required none. Thus matters stood with Florence on the morning when she was going home gladly to her old secluded life. Dr. and Mrs. Bleember, accompanied much against his will by their valued charge Master Barnett, were already gone back to Brighton, where that young gentleman and his fellow pilgrims to Parnassus were then no doubt in the continual resumption of their studies. The holiday time was past, and over. Most of the juvenile guests at the villa had taken their departure, and Florence's long visit was come to an end. There was one guest, however, albeit not resident within the house, who had been very constant in his attentions to the family, and who still remained devoted to them. This was Mr. Toots, who, after renewing some weeks ago the acquaintance he had had the happiness of forming with Skettles Jr. on the night when he burst the Blimberian bonds and soared into freedom with his ring on, called regularly every other day, and left a perfect pack of cards at the hall door, so many indeed that the ceremony was quite a deal on the part of Mr. Toots, and a hand and whist on the part of the servant. Mr. Toots likewise with the bold and happy idea of preventing the family from forgetting him. But there is reason to suppose that this expedient originated in the teeming brain of the chicken, had established a six-oed cutter manned by aquatic friends of the chickens, and steered by that illustrious character in person, who wore a bright red fireman's coat for the purpose, and concealed the perpetual black eye with which he was afflicted beneath a green shade. Previous to the institution of this equipage, Mr. Toots sounded the chicken on a hypothetical case, as supposing the chicken to be enamored of a young lady named Mary, and to have conceived the intention of starting a boat of his own. What would he call that boat? The chicken replied with divers strong asseverations that he would either christen it Paul or the chicken's delight. Improving on this idea, Mr. Toots, after deep study and the exercise of much invention, resolved to call his boat the Toots's Joy, as a delicate compliment to Florence, of which no man, knowing the parties, could possibly miss the appreciation. Stretched on a crimson cushion in his gallant bark, with his shoes in the air, Mr. Toots, in the exercise of his project, had come up the river day after day and week after week, and had flitted to and fro near Sir Barnet's garden, and had caused his crew to cut across and across the river at sharp angles for his better exhibition to any lookers out from Sir Barnet's windows, and had had such evolutions performed by the Tootsie's Joy as had filled all the neighboring part of the waterside with astonishment. But whenever he saw anyone in Sabernot's garden on the brink of the river, Mr. Toots always feigned to be passing there by a combination of coincidences of the most singular and unlikely description. "How are you, Toots?" Sir Barnard would say, waving his hand from the lawn while the artful chicken steered close and shore. "How do you do, Sir Barnard?" Mr. Toots would answer. "What a surprising thing that I should see you here." Mr. Toots, in his sagacity, always said this as if instead of that being Sabana's house, it was some deserted edifice on the banks of the Nile or Ganges. "I never was so surprised," Mr. Toots would exclaim. "Is Miss Tomboy there?" Whereupon Florence would appear. "Perhaps Diogenes is quite well, Miss Tomboy," Toots would cry. "I called to ask this morning." "Thank you very much," the pleasant voice of Florence would reply. "Won't you come ashore?" Toots Barnett would say. "Then come. You're in no hurry. Come and see us." "Oh, it's of no consequence, thank you," Mr. Toots would blushingly rejoin. "I thought Miss Tomboy might like to know. That's all. Goodbye." And poor Mr. Toots, who was dying to accept the invitation, but hadn't the courage to do it, signed to the chicken with an aching heart, and away went the Joy, cleaving the water like an arrow. The Joy was lying in a state of extraordinary splendor at the garden steps on the morning of Florence's departure. When she went downstairs to take leave after her talk with Susan, she found Mr. Toots awaiting her in the drawing room. "Oh, how do you do, Miss Dombey?" said the stricken Toots, always dreadfully disconcerted when the desire of his heart was gained and he was speaking to her. "Thank you. I'm very well indeed. I hope you're the same. So was Diogenes yesterday." "You are very kind," said Florence. "Thank you. It's of no consequence," retorted Mr. Toots. "I thought perhaps you wouldn't mind in this fine weather coming home by water, Miss Tomboy. There's plenty of room in the boat for your maid." "I'm very much obliged to you," said Florence, hesitating. "I really am, but I would rather not." "Oh, it's of no consequence," retorted Mr. Toots. "Good morning. Won't you wait and see Lady Skettles?" asked Florence kindly. "Oh, no, thank you," returned Mr. Toots. "It's of no consequence at all." So shy was Mr. Toots on such occasions, and so flurried. But Lady Scuttles entering at that moment, Mr. Toots was suddenly seized with a passion for asking how she did, and hoping she was very well, nor could Mr. Toots, by any possibility, leave off shaking hands with her until Sir Barnet appeared, to whom he immediately clung with the tenacity of desperation. "We are losing today," Toots said Sabana, turning towards Florence. "The light of our house, I assure you." "Oh, it's of no consequence. I mean, yes, to be sure," faltered the embarrassed Mr. Toots. "Good morning." Notwithstanding the emphatic nature of this farewell, Mr. Toots, instead of going away, stood leering about him vacantly. Florence, to relieve him, bade adieu, with many thanks to Lady Skettles, and gave her arm to Sabinet. "May I beg of you, my dear Miss Dombey," said her host as he conducted her to the carriage, "to present my best compliments to your dear papa." It was distressing to Florence to receive the commission, for she felt as if she were imposing on Sabinet by allowing him to believe that a kindness rendered to her was rendered to her father, as she could not explain. However, she bowed her head and thanked him, and again she thought that the dull home, free from such embarrassments and such reminders of her sorrow, was her natural and best retreat. Such of her late friends and companions as were yet remaining at the villa came running from within and from the garden to say goodbye. They were all attached to her and very earnest in taking leave of her. Even the household was sorry for her going, and the servants came nodding and curtsying round the carriage door as Florence looked round on the kind faces and saw among them those of Sir Barnet and his lady, and of Mr. Toots, who was chuckling and staring at her from a distance. She was reminded of the night when Paul and she had come from Dr. Blimburn's, and when the carriage drove away her face was wet with tears, sorrowful tears, but tears of consolation too, for all the softer memories connected with the dull old house to which she was returning made it dear to her as they rose up. How long it seemed since she had wandered through the silent rooms, since she had last crept softly and afraid into those her father occupied, since she had felt the solemn but yet soothing influence of the beloved dead in every action of her daily life. This new farewell reminded her, besides of her parting with poor Walter, of his looks and words that night, and of the gracious blending she had noticed in him of tenderness for those he left behind, with courage and high spirit. His little history was associated with the old house too, and gave it a new claim and hold upon her heart. Even Susan Nipper softened towards the home of so many years as they were on their way towards it, gloomy as it was and rigid justice as she rendered to its gloom. She forgave it a great deal. "I shall be glad to see it again, I don't deny, miss," said the Nipper. "There ain't much in it to boast of, but I Wouldn't have it burned or pulled down neither. You'll be glad to go through the old rooms, won't you, Susan, said Florence, smiling. Well, miss, returned the nipper, softening more and more towards the house as they approached it nearer. I won't deny. But what I shall, though I shall hate them again tomorrow. Very likely Florence felt that for her there was greater peace within it than elsewhere. It was better and easier to keep her secret shut up there among the tall dark walls than to carry it abroad into the light and try to hide it from a crowd of happy eyes. It was better to pursue the study of her loving heart alone and find no new discouragements in loving hearts about her. It was easier to hope and pray and love on all uncared for, yet with constancy and patience in the tranquil sanctuary of such remembrances. Although it molded, rusted, and decayed about her, than in a new scene let its gaiety be what it would. She welcomed back her old enchanted dream of life and longed for the old dark door to close upon her once again. Full of such thoughts, they turned into the long and somber street. Florence was not on that side of the carriage which was nearest to her home, and as the distance lessened between them and it, she looked out of her window for the children over the way she was thus engaged, when an exclamation from Susan caused her to turn quickly round. Why, gracious me, cried Susan, breathless. Where's our house? Our house, said Florence. Susan, drawing in her head from the window, thrust it out again, drew it in again as the carriage stopped, and stared at her mistress in amazement. There was a labyrinth of scaffolding raised all around the house from the basement to the roof, loads of bricks and stones and heaps of mortar, and piles of wood blocked up half the width and length of the broad street. At the side, ladders were raised against the walls. Laborers were climbing up and down. Men were at work upon the steps of the scaffolding. Painters and decorators were busy inside. Great rolls of ornamental paper were being delivered from a cart at the door, and a postmaster's wagon also stopped the way. No furniture was to be seen through the gaping and broken windows in any of the rooms. Nothing but workmen and the implements of their several trades swarming from the kitchens to the garrets inside and outside alike. Bricklayers, painters, carpenters, masons, hammer, hot brush, pickaxe, saw, and trowel, all at work together in full chorus. Florence descended from the coach, half doubting if it were or could be the right house, until she recognized Taliesin with a sunburned face standing at the door to receive her. There's nothing the matter, inquired Florence. Oh no, miss, there are great alterations going on. Yes, miss, great alterations, said Taliesin. Florence passed him as if she were in a dream and hurried upstairs. The garish light was in the long darkened drawing room, and there were steps and platforms and men in paper caps in the high places. Her mother's picture was gone with the rest of the movables, and on the mark where it had been was scrolled in chalk, "This room," in panel green and gold. The staircase was a labyrinth of posts and planks at the outside of the house, and a whole Olympus of plumbers and glaziers was reclining in various attitudes on the skylight. Her own room was not yet touched within, but there were beams and boards raised against it without bulk in the daylight. She went up swiftly to that other bedroom where the little bed was, and a dark giant of a man with a pipe in his mouth and his head tied up in a pocket handkerchief was staring at the window. It was here that Susan Nipper, who had been in quest of Florence, found her and said would she go downstairs to her papa, who wished to speak to her at home. And wishing to speak to me, cried Florence, trembling. Susan, who was infinitely more distraught than Florence herself, repeated her errand, and Florence, pale and agitated, hurried down. Again, without a moment's hesitation, she thought upon the way down, would she dare to kiss him? The longing of her heart resolved her, and she thought she would. Her father might have heard that heartbeat when it came into his presence one instant, and it would have beat against his breast. But he was not alone. There were two ladies there, and Florence stopped, striving so hard with her emotion that if her brute friend Di had not burst in and overwhelmed her with his caresses as a welcome home. At which one of the ladies gave a little scream, and that diverted her attention from herself. She would have swooned upon the floor. Florence said, her father putting out his hand so stiffly that it held her off. How do you do? Florence took the hand between her own and putting it timidly to her lips yielded to its withdrawal. It touched the door and shutting it with quite as much endearment as it had touched her. What dog is that? Said Mr. Dumby, displeased. It is a dog, Papa, from Brighton. Well, said Mr. Dumby, and a cloud passed over his face, for he understood her. "He is very good-tempered," said Florence, addressing herself with her natural grace and sweetness to the two lady strangers. "He is only glad to see me. Pray forgive him." She saw in the glance they interchanged that the lady who had screamed and who was seated was old, and that the other lady, who stood near her papa, was very beautiful and of an elegant figure. "This is Scutton," said her father, turning to the first and holding out his hand. "This is my daughter Florence." "Charming, I am sure," observed the lady, putting up her glass. "So natural, my darling Florence. You must kiss me, if you please." Florence, having done so, turned towards the other lady, by whom her father stood waiting. "Edith," said Mr. Dombey, "this is my daughter Florence." "Florence, this lady will soon be your mamma." Florence started and looked up at the beautiful face in a conflict of emotions, among which the tears that name awakens struggled for a moment with surprise, interest, admiration, and an indefinable sort of fear. Then she cried out, "Oh, Papa, may you be happy, may you be very, very happy all your life," and then fell weeping on the lady's bosom. There was a short silence. The beautiful lady, who at first had seemed to hesitate whether or no she should advance to Florence, held her to her breast and pressed the hand with which she clasped her close about her waist, as if to reassure her and comfort her. Not one word passed the lady's lips. She bent her head down over Florence, and she kissed her on the cheek, but she said no word. "Shall we go on through the rooms," said Mr. Dombey, "and see how our workmen are doing? Pray allow me, my dear madam." He said this, and offering his arm to Mrs. Scutton, who had been looking at Florence through her glass, as though picturing to herself what she might be made by the infusion from her own copious storehouse, no doubt of a little more heart and nature. Florence was still sobbing on the lady's breast and holding to her, when Mr. Dombey was heard to say from the conservatory, "Let us ask Edith, dear me." "Where is she?" "Edith, my dear," cried Mrs. Scutton. "Where are you looking for?" "Mr. Dombey somewhere." "I know we are here, my love." The beautiful lady released her hold of Florence, and pressing her lips once more upon her face, withdrew hurriedly and joined them. Florence remained standing in the same place, happy, sorry, joyful, and in tears, she knew not how or how long. But all at once, when her new mamma came back and took her in her arms again, "Florence," said the lady hurriedly, and looking into her face with great earnestness, "you will not begin by hating me." "By hating you, mamma," cried Florence, winding her arm round her neck and returning the look. "Hush, begin by thinking well of me," said the beautiful lady. "Begin by believing that I will try to make you happy, and that I am prepared to love you." "Florence, goodbye. We shall meet again soon. Goodbye. Don't stay here now again." She pressed her to her breast. She had spoken in a rapid manner, but firmly, and Florence saw her rejoin them in the other room. And now Florence began to hope that she would learn from her new and beautiful mamma how to gain her father's love, and in her sleep that night in her lost old home, her own mamma smiled radiantly upon the hope and blessed it. Dreaming Florence. Chapter 29. The opening of the eyes of Mrs. Chick. Miss Tokes, all unconscious of any such rare appearances in connection with Mr. Dombey's house as scaffoldings and ladders, and men with their heads tied up in pocket handkerchiefs glaring in at the windows like flying genii or strange birds, having breakfasted one morning at about this eventful period of time on her customary viands, to wit, one French roll rasp, one egg new laid or warranted to be, and one little pot of tea wherein was infused one little silver scoopful of that herb on behalf of Miss Tokes, and one little silver scoopful on behalf of the teapot. A flight of fancy in which good housekeepers' delight went upstairs to set forth the bird waltzes on the harpsichord, to water and arrange the plants, to dust the knick-knacks, and according to her daily custom, to make her little drawing room the garland of Princess's Place. Miss Tokes endued herself with a pair of ancient gloves like dead leaves, in which she was accustomed to perform these avocations, hidden from human sight at other times in a table drawer, and went methodically to work, beginning with the bird waltz, passing by a natural association of ideas to her bird, a very high-shouldered canary, stricken in years and much rumpled, but a piercing singer, as Princess Place well knew, taking next in order the little china ornaments, paper fly cages, and so forth, and coming round in good time to the plants, which generally required to be snipped here and there with a pair of scissors for some botanical reason that was very powerful with Miss Tokes. Miss Tokes was slow in coming to the plants this morning. The weather was warm, the wind southerly, and there was a sigh of the summertime in Princess's Place that turned Miss Tokes's thoughts upon the country. The potboy attached to the princess's arms had come out with a can and trickled water in a flowing pattern all over Princess's place, and it gave the weedy ground a fresh scent, quite a growing scent. Miss Tock said there was a tiny blink of sun peeping in from the great street round the corner, and the smoky sparrows hopped over it and back again, brightening as they passed or bathed in it like a stream, and became glorified sparrows unconnected with chimneys, legends in praise of ginger beer, with pictorial representations of thirsty customers submerged in the effervescence or stunned by the flying corks, were conspicuous in the window of the Princess's Arms. They were making late hay somewhere out of town, and though the fragrance had a long way to come, and many counter fragrances to contend with among the dwellings of the poor, may God reward the worthy gentlemen who stickle for the plague, as part and parcel of the wisdom of our ancestors, and who do their little best to keep those dwellings miserable. Yet it was wafted faintly into Princess's place, whispering of nature and her wholesome air, as such things will even unto prisoners and captives, and those who are desolate and oppressed in very spite of aldermen and knights to boot, at whose sage nod o' war, and how they nod the rolling world stands still. Miss Tokes sat down upon the window seat and thought of her good papa, deceased Mr. Tokes, of the Customs Department of the Public Service, and of her childhood passed at a seaport among a considerable quantity of coal tar and some rusticity. She fell into a softened remembrance of meadows in old time gleaming with buttercups like so many inverted firmaments of golden stars, and how she had made chains of dandelion stalks for youthful vowers of eternal constancy, dressed chiefly in nankeen, and how soon those fetters had withered and broken. Sitting on the window seat and looking out upon the sparrows and the blink of sun, Miss Tox thought likewise of her good mamma, deceased sister to the owner, of the powdered head and pigtail, of her virtues and her rheumatism, and when a man with bulgy legs and a rough voice and a heavy basket on his head that crushed his hat into a mere black muffin came crying flowers down Princess's Place, making his timid little roots of daisy shudder in the vibration of every yell he gave, as though he had been an ogre hawking little children. Summer recollections were so strong upon Miss Tox that she shook her head and murmured she would be comparatively old before she knew it, which seemed likely in her pensive mood. Miss Tox's thoughts went wandering on Mr. Dobby's track, probably because the Major had returned home to his lodgings opposite and had just bowed to her from his window. What other reason could Miss Tox have for connecting Mr. Dobby with her summer days and dandelion fetters? Was he more cheerful, thought Miss Tokes? Was he reconciled to the decrees of fate? Would he ever marry again? And if yes, whom? What sort of person? Now a flush. It was warm weather overspread Miss Tox's face, as while entertaining these meditations, she turned her head and was surprised by the reflection of her thoughtful image in the chimney glass. Another flush succeeded when she saw a little carriage drive into Princess's Place and straight for her own door. Miss Tox arose, took up her scissors hastily, and so coming at last to the plants, was very busy with them, when Mrs. Chick entered the room. "How is my sweetest friend?" exclaimed Miss Tokes. With open arms, a little stateliness was mingled with Miss Tox's sweetest friend's demeanor, but she kissed Miss Tox and said, "Lucretia, thank you, I'm pretty well, I hope you are the same." Mrs. Chick was laboring under a peculiar little monosyllabic cough, a sort of primer or easy introduction to the art of coughing. "You called very early, and how kind that is, my dear," pursued Miss Tokes. "Now have you breakfasted?" "Thank you, Lucretia," said Mrs. Chick, I took an early breakfast." The good lady seemed curious on the subject of Princess's Place and looked all round as she spoke. "With my brother, who has come home. He is better, I trust, my love," faltered Miss Tox. "He is greatly better, thank you, my dear. Louisa must be careful of that cough," remarked Miss Tokes. "It's nothing," returned Mrs. Chick. "It's merely change of weather." "We must expect change of weather?" asked Miss Tox. "In her simplicity of everything," returned Mrs. Dick. "Of course we must. It's a world of change. Any one would surprise me very much, Lucretia, and would greatly alter my opinion of their understanding if they attempted to contradict or evade what is so perfectly evident." "Change!" exclaimed Mrs. Chick with severe philosophy. "Why, my gracious me, what is there that does not change? Even the silkworm, who I am sure might be supposed not to trouble itself about such subjects, changes into all sorts of unexpected things continually." "My Louisa," said the mild Miss Tokes, "is ever happy in her illustrations." "You are so kind, Lucretia," returned Mrs. Chick, a little softened as to say so, And to think so, I hope neither of us may ever have any cause to lessen our opinion of the other Lucretia. I'm sure of it, returned Miss Toggs. Mrs. Chick coughed as before and drew lines on the carpet with the ivory end of her parasol. Miss Toggs, who had experience of her fair friend and knew that under the pressure of any slight fatigue or vexation, she was prone to a discursive kind of irritability, availed herself of the pause to change the subject. Pardon me, my dear Louisa, said Miss Toggs, but have I caught sight of the manly form of Mr. Chick in the carriage? He is there, said Mrs. Chick, but pray leave him there. He has his newspaper, and would be quite contented for the next 2 hours. Go on with your flowers, Lucretia, and allow me to sit here and rest. My Louisa knows, observed Miss Tokes, that between friends like ourselves any approach to ceremony would be out of the question. Therefore Miss Tokes finished the sentence, not in words, but action, and putting on her gloves again, which she had taken off, and arming herself once more with her scissors, began to snip and clip among the leaves with microscopic industry. Florence has returned home also, said Mrs. Chick, after sitting silent for some time, with her head on one side and her parasol sketching on the floor. And really, Florence is a great deal too old now to continue to lead that solitary life to which she has been accustomed. Of course she is, there can be no doubt about it. I should have very little respect indeed for anybody who could advocate a different opinion. Whatever my wishes might be, I could not respect them. We cannot command our feelings to such an extent as that. Miss Toggs assented, without being particular as to the intelligibility of the proposition. If she is a strange girl, said Mrs. Chick, and if my brother Paul cannot feel perfectly comfortable in her society, after all the sad things that have happened and all the terrible disappointments that have been undergone, then what is the reply? That he must make an effort, that he is bound to make an effort. We have always been a family remarkable for effort. Paul is, at the head of the family, almost the only representative of it left. For what am I? I am of no consequence. My dearest love, remonstrated Miss Toggs. Mrs. Chick dried her eyes, which were for the moment overflowing, and proceeded, and consequently, he is more than ever bound to make an effort, and though his having done so comes upon me with a sort of shock, for mine is a very weak and foolish nature, which is anything but a blessing. I am sure I often wish my heart was a marble slab or a paving stone. My sweet Louisa, remonstrated Miss Toggs again, still, it is a triumph to me to know that he is so true to himself and to his name of Dombey, although of course I always knew he would be. I only hope, said Mrs. Chick after a pause, that she may be worthy of the name too. Miss Toggs filled a little green watering pot from a jug, and happening to look up when she had done so, was so surprised by the amount of expression Mrs. Chick had conveyed into her face and was bestowing upon her that she put the little watering pot on the table for the present and sat down near it. My dear Louisa, said Miss Toggs, will it be the least satisfaction to you if I venture to observe in reference to that remark that I, as a humble individual, think your sweet niece in every way most promising? What do you mean, Lactitia? returned Mrs. Chick with increased stateliness of manner. To what remark of mine, my dear, do you refer? Her being worthy of her name, my love, replied Miss Tokes. If, said Mrs. Chick, with solemn patience, I have not expressed myself with clearness, Lucretia, the fault of course is mine. There is perhaps no reason why I should express myself at all, except the intimacy that has subsisted between us, and which I very much hope, Lucretia, confidently hope, nothing will occur to disturb, because why should I do anything else? There is no reason, it would be absurd, but I wish to express myself clearly, Lucretia, and therefore to go back to that remark, I must beg to say that it was not intended to relate to Florence in any way. Indeed, returned Miss Tokes. No, said Miss Chick shortly and decisively. Pardon me, my dear, rejoined her meek friend, but I cannot have understood it. I fear I am dull. Mrs. Chick looked round the room and over the way, at the plants, at the bird, at the watering pot, at almost everything within view except Miss Tokes, and finally, dropping her glance upon Miss Tokes for a moment on its way to the ground, said, looking meanwhile with elevated eyebrows at the carpet, when I speak, Lucretia, of her being worthy of the name, I speak of my brother Paul's second wife. I believe I have already said, in effect, if not in the very words I now use, that it is his intention to marry a second wife. Miss Tokes left her seat in a hurry and return to her plants, clipping among the stems and leaves with as little favor as a barber working at so many pauper heads of hair. Whether she will be fully sensible of the distinction conferred upon her, said Mrs. Chick in a lofty tone, is quite another question. I hope she may be. We are bound to think well of one another in this world, and I hope she may be. I have not been advised with myself. If I had been advised with, I have no doubt my advice would have been cavalierly received, and therefore it is infinitely better as it is. I much prefer it as it is. Miss Tokes, with head bent down, still clipped among the plants. Mrs. Chick, with energetic shaking of her own head from time to time, continued to hold forth as if in defiance of somebody. If my brother Paul had consulted with me, which he sometimes does, or rather sometimes used to do, for he will naturally do that no more now, and this is a circumstance which I regard as a relief from responsibility, said Mrs. Chick hysterically, for I thank heaven I am not jealous here. Mrs. Chick again shed tears. If my brother Paul had come to me and had said, Louisa, what kind of qualities would you advise me to look out for in a wife? I should certainly have answered, Paul, you must have family, you must have beauty, you must have dignity, you must have connection. Those are the words I should have used. You might have led me to the block immediately afterwards, said Mrs. Chick, as if that consequence were highly probable, but I should have used them. I should have said, Paul, you to marry a second time without family, you to marry without beauty, you to marry without dignity, you to marry without connection. There is nobody in the world, not mad, who could dream of daring to entertain such a preposterous idea. Miss Tokes stopped clipping, and with her head among the plants listened attentively. Perhaps Miss Tokes thought there was hope in this exhortation and the warmth of Mrs. Chick. I should have adopted this course of argument, pursued the discreet lady, because I trust I am not a fool. I make no claim to be considered a person of superior intellect, though I believe some people have been extraordinary enough to consider me so. One so little humored as I am would very soon be disabused of any such notion. But I trust I am not a downright fool, and to tell me, said Mrs. Chick with ineffable disdain, that my brother Paul Dunbar could ever contemplate the possibility of uniting himself to anybody. I don't care who. She was more sharp and emphatic in that short clause than in any other part of her discourse. Not possessing these requisites would be to insult what understanding I have got, as much as if I was to be told that I was born and bred an elephant, which I may be told next, said Mrs. Chick with resignation. It wouldn't surprise me at all. I expected in the moment's silence that ensued. Miss Tokes's scissors gave a feeble clip or two, but Miss Tokes's face was still invisible, and Miss Tokes's morning gown was agitated. Mrs. Chick looked sideways at her through the intervening plants, and went on to say in a tone of bland conviction, and as one dwelling on a point of fact that hardly required to be stated, therefore, of course, my brother Paul has done what was to be expected of him, and what anybody might have foreseen he would do if he entered the marriage state again. I confess it takes me rather by surprise, however gratifying, because when Paul went out of town, I had no idea at all that he would form any attachment out of town, and he certainly had no attachment when he left here. However, it seems to be extremely desirable in every point of view. I have no doubt the mother is a most genteel and elegant creature, and I have no right whatever to dispute the policy of her living with them, which is Paul's affair, not mine. And as to Paul's choice herself, I have only seen her picture yet, but that is beautiful indeed. Her name is beautiful too, said Mrs. Chick, shaking her head with energy and arranging herself in her chair. Edith is at once uncommon, as it strikes me, and distinguished. Consequently, Lucretia, I have no doubt you will be happy to hear that the marriage is to take place immediately. Of course, you will great emphasis again, and that you are delighted with this change in the condition of my brother, who has shown you a great deal of pleasant attention at various times. Miss Tokes made no verbal answer, but took up the little watering pot with a trembling hand, and looked vacantly round, as if considering what article of furniture would be improved by the contents. The room door opening at this crisis of Miss Tokes's feelings, she started, laughed aloud, and fell into the arms of the person entering, happily insensible alike of Mrs. Chick's indignant countenance and of the Major at his window over the way, who had his double-battled eyeglass in full action, and whose face and figure were dilated with Mephistophelian joy. Not so the expatriated native, amazed supporter of Miss Tokes's swooning form, who, coming straight upstairs with a polite inquiry touching Miss Tokes's health in exact pursuance of the Major's malicious Instructions had accidentally arrived in the very nick of time to catch the delicate burden in his arms and to receive the contents of the little watering pot in his shoe, both of which circumstances coupled with his consciousness of being closely watched by the wrathful major who had threatened the usual penalty, in regard of every bone in his skin in case of any failure, combined to render him a moving spectacle of mental and bodily distress for some moments. This afflicted foreigner remained clasping Miss Stocks to his heart with an energy of action and remarkable opposition to his disconcerted face, while that poor lady trickled slowly down upon him the very last sprinklings of the little watering pot, as if he were a delicate exotic, which indeed he was, and might be almost expected to blow while the gentle rain descended. Mrs. Chick, at length recovering sufficient presence of mind to interpose, commanded him to drop Miss Stocks upon the sofa and withdraw and the exile. Promptly obeying, she applied herself to promote Miss Stocks' recovery, but none of that gentle concern which usually characterizes the daughters of Eve in the tending of each other, none of that freemasonry and fainting by which they are generally bound together in a mysterious bond of sisterhood, was visible in Mrs. Chick's demeanor, rather like the executioner who restores the victim to sensation previous to proceeding with the torture, or was wont to do so in the good old times. For which old true men were perpetual mourning did Mrs. Chick administer the smelling bottle, the slapping on the hands, the dashing of cold water on the face, and the other proved remedies. And when at length Mrs. Stocks opened her eyes and gradually became restored to animation and consciousness, Mrs. Chick drew off as from a criminal, and reversing the precedent of the murdered King of Denmark, regarded her more in anger than in sorrow. Lucretia, said Mrs. Chick, I will not attempt to disguise what I feel. My eyes are opened all at once. I wouldn't have believed this if a saint had told it to me. I am foolish to give way to faintness. Miss Stocks faltered. I shall be better presently. You will be better presently, Lucretia, repeated Mrs. Chick with exceeding scorn. Do you suppose I am blind? Do you imagine I am in my second childhood? No, Lucretia, I am obliged to you. Miss Stocks directed an imploring, helpless kind of look towards her friend and put her handkerchief before her face. If anyone had told me this yesterday, said Mrs. Chick with majesty, or even half an hour ago, I should have been tempted, I almost believe, to strike them to the earth. Lucretia talks. My eyes are open to you all at once. The scales here, Mrs. Chick cast down an imaginary pair, such as are commonly used in grocery shops, have fallen from my sight. The blindness of my confidence is past, Lucretia. It has been abused and played upon, and evasion is quite out of the question now, I assure you. Oh, to what do you allude so cruelly, my love? asked Miss Stocks through her tears. Lucretia, said Mrs. Chick, ask your own heart. I must entreat you not to address me by any such familiar terms. You've just used, if you please. I have some self-respect left, though you may think otherwise. Oh, Louisa, cried Miss Turquoise, how can you speak to me like that? How can I speak to you like that? retorted Mrs. Chick, who, in default of having any particular argument to sustain herself upon, relied principally on such repetitions for her most withering effects. Like that, you may well say, like that. Indeed, Miss Togg sobbed pitifully. The idea, said Mrs. Chick, of your having basked at my brother's fireside like a serpent, and wound yourself through me almost into his confidence, Lucretia, that you might in secret entertain designs upon him and dare to aspire to contemplate the possibility of his uniting himself to you. Why, it is an idea, said Mrs. Chick with sarcastic dignity, the absurdity of which almost relieves its treachery. Pray, Louisa, urged Mrs. Stocks, do not say such dreadful things. Dreadful things, repeated Mrs. Chick. Dreadful things. Is it not a fact, Lucretia, that you have just now been unable to command your feelings even before me, whose eyes you had so completely closed? I have made no complaint, sobbed Miss Stocks. Have said nothing. If I have been a little overpowered by your news, Louisa, and have ever had any lingering thought that Mr. Dobby was inclined to be particular towards me, surely you will not condemn me. She's going to say, said Mrs. Chick, addressing herself to the whole of the furniture in a comprehensive glance of resignation and appeal, she's going to say I do it, that I have encouraged her. I don't wish to exchange reproaches, dear Louisa, sobbed Miss Stocks, nor do I wish to complain, but in my own defense, yes, cried Mrs. Chick, looking around the room with a prophetic smile. That's what she's going to say. I knew it. You had better say it. Say it openly. Be open, Lucia talks, said Mrs. Chick with desperate sternness. Whatever you are, in my own defense, faltered Miss Stocks, And only in my own defense against your unkind words, my dear Louisa, I would merely ask you if you haven't often favored such a fancy, and even said it might happen for anything we could tell. There is a point, said Mrs. Chick, rising, not as if she were going to stop at the floor, but as if she were about to soar up high into her native skies, beyond which endurance becomes ridiculous, if not culpable. I can bear much, but not too much. What spell was on me when I came into this house this day, I don't know, but I had a presentiment, a dark presentiment, said Mrs. Chick with a shiver, that something was going to happen. Well, may I have had that foreboding, Lucretia, when my confidence of many years is destroyed in an instant, when my eyes are opened all at once, and when I find you revealed in your true colors. Lucretia, I have been mistaken in you. It is better for us both that this subject should end here. I wish you well, and I shall ever wish you well, but as an individual who desires to be true to herself in her own poor position, whatever that position may be or may not be, and as the sister of my brother, and as the sister-in-law of my brother's wife, and as a connection by marriage of my brother's wife's mother, may I be permitted to add as a Dombey, I can wish you nothing else but good morning. These words, delivered with cutting suavity, tempered and chastened by a lofty air of moral rectitude, carried the speaker to the door. There she inclined her head in a ghostly and statue-like manner, and so withdrew to her cottage to seek comfort and consolation in the arms of Mr. Chick, her lord, figuratively speaking. That is to say, for the arms of Mr. Chick were full of his newspaper. Neither did that gentleman address his eyes towards his wife otherwise than by stealth, neither did he offer any consolation whatever. In short, he sat reading and humming fag ends of tunes, and sometimes glancing furtively at her, without delivering himself of a word, good, bad, or indifferent. In the meantime, Mrs. Chick sat swelling and bridling and tossing her head as if she was still repeating that solemn formula of farewell to Lucretia Tox. At length she said aloud, "Oh, the extent to which her eyes had been opened that day, to which your eyes have been opened, my dear," repeated Mr. Chick. "Oh, don't talk to me," said Mrs. Chick. "If you can bear to see me in this state, and not ask me what the matter is, you would better hold your tongue forever." "What is the matter, my dear?" asked Mr. Chick. "To think," said Mrs. Chick in a state of soliloquy, "that she should ever have conceived the base idea of connecting herself with our family by a marriage with Paul. To think that when she was playing at horses with that dear child who is now in his grave, I never liked it at the time, she should have been hiding such a double-faced design. I wonder she was never afraid that something would happen to her. She is fortunate if nothing does. I really thought, my dear," said Mr. Chick slowly, after rubbing the bridge of his nose for some time with his newspaper, "that you had gone on the same tack yourself all along until this morning, and had thought it would be a convenient thing enough if it could have been brought about." Mrs. Chick instantly burst into tears and told Mr. Chick that if he wished to trample upon her with his boots, he had better do it. "But with Lucretia Tox I have done," said Mrs. Chick, after abandoning herself to her feelings for some minutes. To Mr. Chick's great terror, "I can bear to resign Paul's confidence in favor of one who I hope and trust may be deserving of it, and with whom he has a perfect right to replace poor Fanny if he chooses. I can bear to be informed in Paul's cool manner of such a change in his plans, and never to be consulted until all is settled and determined. But deceit I cannot bear, and with Lucretia Tox I have done. It is better, as it is said, Mrs. Chick, piously much better. It would have been a long time before I could have accommodated myself comfortably with her after this, and I really don't know as Paul is going to be very grand, and these are people of condition, that she would have been quite presentable, and might not have compromised myself. There's a providence in everything. Everything works for the best. I have been tried today, but upon the whole I do not regret it." In which Christian's spirit Mrs. Chick dried her eyes and smoothed her lap, and sat as became a person calm under a great wrong. Mr. Chick, feeling his unworthiness, no doubt took an early opportunity of being sat down at a street corner, and walking away whistling with his shoulders very much raised, and his hands in his pockets, while poor excommunicated Miss Tokes, who if she were a forager and toad-eater was at least an honest and a constant one, and had ever borne a faithful friendship towards her impure, and had been truly absorbed and swallowed up in devotion to the magnificence of Mr. Dobby, while poor excommunicated Miss Tokes watered her plants with her tears, and felt that it was winter in Princess's Place. Chapter 30. The interval before the marriage, although the enchanted house was no more, and the working world had broken into it, and was hammering and crashing, and tramping up and downstairs all day long, keeping Diogenes in an incessant paroxysm of barking from sunrise to sunset, evidently convinced that his enemy had got the better of him at last, and was then sacking the premises in triumphant defiance. There was at first no other great change in the method of Florence's life at night. When the work people went away, the house was dreary and deserted again, and Florence, listening to their voices echoing through the hall and staircase as they departed, pictured to herself the cheerful homes to which they were returning, and the children who were waiting for them, and was glad to think that they were merry and well pleased to go. She welcomed back the evening silence as an old friend, but it came now with an altered face, and looked more kindly on her. Fresh hope was in it. The beautiful lady who had soothed and caressed her in the very room in which her heart had been so wrung was a spirit of promise to her. Soft shadows of the bright life dawning when her father's affection should be gradually won, and all or much should be restored of what she had lost on the dark day when a mother's love had faded. With a mother's last breath on her cheek, moved about her in the twilight, and were welcome company peeping at the rosy children, her neighbors. It was a new and precious sensation to think that they might soon speak together and know each other, when she would not fear as of old to show herself before them, lest they should be grieved to see her in her black dress, sitting there alone in her thoughts of her new mother, and in the love and trust overflowing her pure heart towards her. Florence loved her own dead mother more and more. She had no fear of setting up a rival in her breast. The new flower sprang from the deep-planted and long-cherished root. She knew every gentle word that had fallen from the lips of the beautiful lady sounded to Florence like an echo of the voice long hushed and silent. How could she love that memory less for living tenderness, when it was her memory of all parental tenderness and love? Florence was one day sitting reading in her room and thinking of the lady and her promised visit soon, for her book turned on a kindred subject, when, raising her eyes, she saw her standing in the doorway. "Mama!" cried Florence, joyfully meeting her. "Come again." "Not Mama yet," returned the lady with a serious smile as she encircled Florence's neck with her arm. "But very soon to be," cried Florence. "Very soon now, Florence, very soon." Edith bent her head a little so as to press the blooming cheek of Florence against her own, and for some few moments remained thus silent. There was something so very tender in her manner that Florence was even more sensible of it than on the first occasion of their meeting. She led Florence to a chair beside her, and sat down. Florence, looking in her face, quite wondering at its beauty, and willingly leaving her hand in hers. "Have you been alone, Florence, since I was here last?" "Oh yes," smiled Florence hastily. She hesitated and cast down her eyes, for her new mamma was very earnest in her look, and the look was intently and thoughtfully fixed upon her face. I am used to be alone," said Florence. "I don't mind it at all, and I pass whole days together sometimes." Florence might have said whole weeks and months. "Is thou your maid?" laughed my dog, Mama, said Florence, laughing. "Susan is my maid." "And these are your rooms," said Edith, looking round. "I was not shown these rooms the other day. We must have them improved, Florence. They shall be made the prettiest in the house." "If I might change them, Mama," returned Florence. "There is one upstairs I should like much better." "Is this not high enough, dear girl?" asked Edith, smiling. "The other was my brother's room," said Florence, "and I'm very fond of it. I would have spoken to Papa about it when I came home and found the workmen here and everything changing." But Florence dropped her eyes lest the same look should make her falter again. "But I was afraid it might distress him, and as you said you would be here again soon, Mama, and are the mistress of everything, I determined to take courage and ask you." Edith sat looking at her with her brilliant eyes intent upon her face, until Florence, raising her own, she in her turn withdrew her gaze and turned it on the ground. It was then that Florence thought how different this lady's beauty was from what she had supposed. She had thought it of a proud and lofty kind, yet her manner was so subdued and gentle that, if she had been Florence's own age and character, it scarcely could have invited confidence more, except when a constrained and singular reserve crept over her. And then she seemed, but Florence hardly understood this, though she could not choose but notice it and think about it, as if she were humbled before Florence, and ill at ease when she had said that she was not her mamma yet, and when Florence had called her the mistress of everything there. This change in her was quick and startling, and now while the eyes of Florence rested on her face, she sat as though she would have shrunken, hidden from her rather than as one about to love and cherish her in right of such a near connection. She gave Florence her ready promise about her new room and said she would give directions about it herself. She then asked some questions concerning poor Paul, and when they had sat in conversation for some time, told Florence she had come to take her to her own home. We have come to London now, my mother, and I said, Edith, and you shall stay with us until I am married. I wish that we should know and trust each other. Florence, you are very kind to me, said Florence. Dear Mama, how much I thank you. Let me say now, for it may be the best opportunity, continued Edith, looking round to see that they were quite alone and speaking in a lower voice, that when I am married and have gone away for some weeks, I shall be easier at heart if you will come home here, no matter who invites you to stay elsewhere. Come home here. It is better to be alone than what I would say is, she added, checking herself, that I know well you are best at home, dear Florence.